Welcome back. This is Midnight Crime. If you enjoy falling asleep to these stories, feel free to like the video and subscribe. And before we begin, what time is it where you are, and where are you listening from tonight? Alright, let's head straight into our first story. Case 1. At 6:12 a.m., on a Tuesday that began like any other, the morning bus arrived at the corner of Alder and Finch and opened its doors to no one. The driver, a man named Tomas Virek, who had driven the same route for 13 years, would later say that what unsettled him most was not what he saw, but what he didn't. The bench was occupied, a canvas tote bag neatly folded beside a thermos, a pair of gloves placed on top as if someone had just slipped them off. A faint line of steam still curled from the thermos lid. The streetlight above flickered weakly in the early dawn, and the air carried that damp, metallic scent that comes after a night of light rain. But there was no person. Tomas waited longer than usual, his hand resting on the door lever, eyes scanning the quiet residential street. A curtain shifted in one of the houses across the road. Somewhere, a dog barked once and stopped. He leaned slightly out of his seat and called, "Morning," as he always did. No one answered. After a moment, he closed the doors and drove on. He would think about it again 20 minutes later when the dispatch radio crackled with a missing persons call from that exact corner. The town of Brindle Hollow was not large enough to hide things easily. It lay in a shallow valley bordered by low forested hills, where the trees leaned inward as if listening. In the mornings, a light mist often settled between the houses, clinging to porches and hedges, softening the edges of everything. People noticed absences there. They noticed when a porch light stayed on too long, or when a car remained parked in the same position for days. By noon, everyone knew that Mara Ellison had not boarded the bus. Mara was 34, a school archivist at Brindle Hollow Secondary. She lived alone in a narrow blue house with white trim, the kind that creaked gently when the temperature changed. Her routines were precise without being rigid. She left her house at 6:05 each morning, walked 3 blocks, and reached the bus stop at 6:10. She always carried the same canvas tote, always filled her thermos with black tea, always wore gloves in colder months, even when others did not. It was this consistency that made her absence feel like a disruption rather than a coincidence. Detective Elian Rook arrived at the scene just after 1 p.m., when the mist had burned off and the street was dry. He stood beside the bench, hands in the pockets of his coat, and took in the small arrangement left behind. The tote bag had been examined already, but he crouched slightly to look again, careful not to disturb anything. Inside the bag were 2 books, a thin binder of archived school records, and a small envelope containing receipts. Nothing unusual. The thermos was still warm to the touch when the first officer had arrived. The gloves were lined up neatly, fingers aligned. Rook looked at the pavement. There were faint footprints, softened by the earlier dampness, but nothing that suggested a struggle. No scuff marks, no dropped items, no signs of haste. He stood again and glanced down the length of the street. It was the kind of place where sound carried, where a raised voice or sudden movement would not go unnoticed. Yet no one had reported anything. A neighbor named Lydia Caro stepped forward from her porch when she saw him. "I heard the bus stop," she said, her voice low, as if speaking too loudly might disturb something fragile. "I always do. It's right there." She pointed, though the location was obvious. "Did you see Mara this morning?" Rook asked. Lydia shook her head. "No, I usually see her walking. She has that steady pace. You know? Not fast, not slow." She paused. "I didn't see her today. Did you hear anything unusual?" She hesitated, then frowned slightly. "There was a sound. I thought it was I don't know. Like something brushing against wood. Maybe the bench. But it was brief. Before or after the bus arrived? Before, I think. It's hard to say. Everything's quiet around that time. Rook nodded and thanked her. He made a small note in his pocket notebook, then looked again at the bench. The wood slats were damp in places, dry in others. He ran a finger lightly along the edge. There was a faint smear, barely visible, as if something had pressed there and then been removed. He straightened and stepped back. The absence, he thought, had shape. At Mara's house, the front door was unlocked. Inside, everything appeared undisturbed. The kitchen sink was empty, a single cup drying on a rack. A faint scent of tea lingered in the air, mingling with the clean, slightly dusty smell of old paper. The living room held a small bookshelf, neatly arranged, and a narrow table with a stack of unopened mail. Rook moved through the space slowly, noting details. A chair slightly pulled out from the table. A pair of shoes placed side by side near the door. A wall clock ticking steadily, its sound more pronounced in the quiet. In the bedroom, the bed was made. A light sweater lay folded at the foot. The window was closed, the latch secure. Nothing suggested that Mara had left in a hurry. In the small study at the back of the house, he found something that gave him pause. On the desk, beside a neat stack of archival files, was a sheet of paper with a single line written in careful handwriting. Return to where it was first misplaced. The ink was fresh. Rook stood there for a moment, reading the sentence again. It was not frantic, not rushed. The letters were evenly spaced, the pressure consistent. Whoever had written it had taken their time. He glanced at the files. They were labeled with dates, most of them decades old. School records, attendance logs, disciplinary notes, the quiet, mundane history of a place. He picked up the top file and opened it. Inside were documents from the early 1980s. Names, signatures, annotations in faded ink. Nothing immediately unusual. He replaced the file and stepped back. Outside, the afternoon had grown still. The trees along the street barely moved. A distant lawn mower hummed and then cut off abruptly, leaving a hollow quiet in its wake. Over the next few days, the investigation moved in careful increments. They spoke to colleagues at the school. Mara had been quiet but approachable, known for her meticulous work and her preference for order. She had no known conflicts, no recent changes in behavior. She liked patterns, one teacher said. She'd notice when something didn't fit. Rook returned to the school archives late one afternoon when the building was nearly empty. The room was in the basement, where the air was cooler and carried the faint scent of old paper and glue. Rows of shelves held boxes labeled by year. He located Mara's workspace, a small desk with a reading lamp and a magnifying glass. Everything was arranged with care. He began to go through the files she had been working on. At first, it was a slow, methodical process. Names and dates blurred together. Attendance sheets, grade reports, notes about minor incidents. Then he noticed a pattern. It was subtle, easy to overlook. A handful of records from different years had small discrepancies. A student listed as present in one document but absent in another. A signature that appeared twice, identical in a way that suggested copying rather than repetition. He marked the files and set them aside. As he continued, the pattern grew clearer. These discrepancies were not random. They clustered around certain dates, certain classes. And in several instances, a name appeared that did not correspond to any known student. The name was always the same, Alan Varies. Rook leaned back slightly, the chair creaking under him. He checked the enrollment records. No Alan Varies had ever been officially registered at the school, yet the name appeared in attendance logs, and handwritten notes, even in a faded photograph tucked into one of the files. A group of students standing in front of the school building. On the back, in careful script, several names were listed. One of them was Alan Varys. Rook studied the photograph. The faces were small, slightly blurred by age. It was difficult to say which one might be Alan. He turned the photo over again, tracing the name with his finger. A quiet unease settled in. That evening, he returned to Mara's house. The note on her desk felt different now, returned to where it was first misplaced. He looked again at the files she had been working on. Several were missing. Not many, just enough to create a gap. He checked the shelves in the study, then the living room. Nothing. Then he noticed something near the back door, a faint line of dirt, as if something had been dragged lightly across the floor. It led to the door and stopped. He opened it. The backyard was small, enclosed by a low wooden fence. The ground was soft from recent rain, the grass flattened in places. He stepped outside and followed the faint disturbance. It led to the fence, where one of the boards was slightly loose. Beyond the fence, a narrow path wound between overgrown shrubs and into a stand of trees that bordered the edge of town. Rook paused, listening. The air was still. The trees stood close together, their branches forming a loose canopy that filtered the light into shifting patterns. He stepped through the gap in the fence and onto the path. Each step was quiet, the ground soft beneath his shoes. The scent of damp earth and leaves rose around him. Somewhere deeper in the trees, water dripped steadily, a slow, irregular rhythm. The path was not well used, but it was not entirely abandoned either. There were signs of passage, a broken twig, a slight indentation in the soil. He followed it. After several minutes, the trees thinned, revealing a small clearing. At its center stood an old structure, a narrow wooden shed, its paint long faded, the roof slightly sagging. It looked as though it had been there for decades, overlooked and gradually absorbed into the landscape. The door was ajar. Rook approached slowly, the wood creaking softly underfoot. He pushed the door open. Inside, the air was cooler. The smell of old wood and dust was stronger here, mixed with something faintly metallic. The space was mostly empty, save for a few scattered objects, a broken chair, a rusted metal box, and, near the far wall, a stack of papers. He moved toward them. They were school records. The missing files, carefully arranged. On top of the stack was a single sheet of paper, identical to the one on Mara's desk. In the same careful handwriting, it read, "Not all records belong to time." Rook stood there for a long moment, listening to the quiet. Then he heard it, a faint sound just beyond the wall of the shed. A slow, deliberate movement, like something brushing lightly against wood. He turned toward the sound, his breath steady. "Hello," he said, his voice low. The sound stopped. Silence settled again, deeper than before. Rook stepped outside, moving around the side of the shed. The clearing was empty, but the ground told a different story. There were footprints. Not many, just enough to suggest someone had been standing there recently. They were shallow, the edges soft, as if made with care. He followed them a few steps, but they faded quickly into the undergrowth. He stood there, the quiet pressing in. In the days that followed, the investigation expanded outward. They searched the woods, the clearing, the surrounding area. They found nothing more. No trace of Mara. No additional clues. But the files, once examined more closely, revealed something that shifted the direction of the case. The discrepancies were not errors. They were corrections. Each instance where Alan Varys appeared corresponded to a real student whose record had been altered. In some cases, entire entries had been replaced. Names changed, dates adjusted. It was as if someone had inserted a presence into the past, carefully weaving it into existing records. And then, just as carefully, removing it. Mara had noticed. She had followed the pattern back through decades of records, tracing the changes, identifying the points where something had been misplaced. Rook returned to the bus stop one evening, just before dawn. The street was quiet, the air cool. The bench stood empty. He sat down, resting his hands on his knees, and waited. At 6:10, the light shifted slightly, the first hint of morning filtering through the trees. And for a brief moment, so brief he could not be certain it had happened at all, he thought he saw someone standing at the edge of the street. A figure, still and indistinct. Then it was gone. The bus arrived at 6:12, its doors opening with a soft hiss. Rook did not move. The driver glanced at him, then at the empty space beside the bench. "Someone missing?" he asked quietly. Rook looked at the thermos mark still faintly visible on the wood, at the place where the gloves had rested. "Yes," he said. The doors closed. The bus pulled away, and the street returned to its quiet, holding its absence with the same careful stillness it always had. Rook remained on the bench a while after the bus had gone, long enough for the quiet to settle back into its usual shape. The early light spread slowly across the street, flattening the shadows, revealing small details that had been hidden before. A damp patch on the pavement where the thermos had once rested. A thin crack in the wood of the bench, darkened by moisture. The faint smell of wet leaves drifting from somewhere beyond the houses. A car passed at the far end of the street, tires whispering against the road, then disappeared. No one else came. When he finally stood, the movement felt deliberate, as if he were stepping out of something that might close behind him if he waited too long. He walked the length of the street once more, not searching for anything specific, just letting his eyes move over the ordinary details. A mailbox slightly ajar. A garden hose coiled loosely beside a wall. The same curtain across the road, still drawn, no longer shifting. At the corner, he paused. There was a narrow alley he had not paid much attention to before, a thin passage between two houses, partially obscured by overgrown hedges. It led away from the bus stop at an angle, disappearing behind a line of fences. He stepped toward it. The ground there was softer, less worn. The smell changed slightly, becoming more enclosed, tinged with damp soil and something faintly metallic. The alley was quiet in a different way, as if it held on to sound rather than letting it pass through. He moved slowly, careful where he placed his feet. About halfway down, he noticed a mark on one of the fence boards, a small, shallow indentation, as if something had pressed against it. Not hard enough to break the wood, but enough to leave a trace. He ran his fingers over it. It felt recent. A few steps further, he found another, lower this time, closer to the ground. And then another, spaced irregularly, leading toward the far end of the passage. They were not footprints. Not exactly. More like points of contact. Brief, deliberate. At the end of the alley, the space opened onto a narrow service road that ran behind the houses. The road was lined with gravel, uneven and lightly scattered with fallen leaves. Rook stepped out and looked both ways. To the left, the road curved gently toward a row of garages and small storage sheds. To the right, it stretched toward the edge of town, where the houses thinned and the land began to slope upward toward the wooded hills. He turned right. The gravel shifted underfoot with a soft crunch, the sound muted by the stillness of the morning. A faint breeze moved through the trees in the distance, carrying with it the smell of pine and damp bark. After a short walk, he came to a place where the road widened slightly, forming a small clearing of sorts. There was an old utility building there, a low, concrete structure with a flat roof and a rusted metal door. A faded sign hung crookedly on one side, its lettering worn almost beyond recognition. He approached it slowly. The door was closed, but not locked. When he pulled it open, the hinges gave a low, drawn-out creak. Inside, the air was cool and still. The room was sparsely furnished, a few metal shelves along the walls, most of them empty, and a long workbench covered in a thin layer of dust. A single narrow window near the ceiling let in a muted strip of light. Rook stepped inside, letting the door fall shut behind him. The quiet here felt different from the quiet outside, more contained. He moved toward the workbench. There were marks in the dust, faint, overlapping lines where something had been placed and then removed. Not recently, but not long ago either. The edges of the marks were still defined. Near the center of the bench, he found a small object. It was a fragment of paper, torn unevenly along one edge. He picked it up carefully. There was handwriting on it, first misplaced. The rest of the sentence was missing. He held it for a moment, then slipped it into his pocket. On the far side of the room, one of the shelves held a metal box, similar to the one in the shed. Its lid was slightly ajar. He opened it. Inside were more papers, not official records this time, but loose sheets, some typed, some handwritten. They appeared to be copies or notes, fragments of information taken from larger documents. Names, dates, locations, and, again, the name Alan varies, appearing at irregular intervals, sometimes circled, sometimes underlined, sometimes simply written in the margin. Rook flipped through the pages slowly. One of them caught his attention. It was a hand-drawn map, rough, but detailed enough to be recognizable. It showed a portion of Brindle Hollow, the streets near the bus stop, the school, the wooded area beyond Mara's house. Several points were marked with small circles. He leaned closer. The bus stop was one of them. The shed in the clearing was another. And this building. There were two more points marked further out, one near the edge of the woods, and another deeper into the hills, where the map became less precise. He studied the markings for a moment, then folded the map and placed it in his coat. When he stepped back outside, the light had shifted slightly. The morning had settled into a pale, steady brightness, though the air still held a trace of dampness. He stood for a moment, looking toward the hills. Then he turned and walked back toward the houses. Later that day, he visited the town records office. It was a quiet building, tucked between a library and a small post office, its interior filled with the soft rustle of paper and the faint hum of fluorescent lights. The air carried the familiar scent of aging documents, dry, slightly sweet, with a hint of dust. A clerk named Irina Vallis sat behind the front desk, sorting through a stack of folders. She looked up as Rook approached. "Detective," she said, offering a small, polite nod. "I heard about Mara." Rook returned the nod. "I need to look at some older records. Property surveys, maintenance logs. Anything that might mention utility structures near Alder and Finch." Irina considered this for a moment, then gestured toward the back room. "We have archives going back about 50 years. Older than that is less organized." "That's fine." She led him through a narrow hallway lined with shelves, then into a larger room where rows of filing cabinets stretched out in careful order. "Let me know if you need help," she said, before returning to the front. Rook began his search. It was slow work. He moved through the files methodically, pulling out documents, scanning them, replacing them. Maintenance reports, construction permits, inspection logs, each one offering small pieces of information, most of them routine. After some time, He found a set of records related to municipal infrastructure. One entry mentioned the utility building he had just visited. It had been constructed in the late 1970s, originally intended as a storage facility for road maintenance equipment. There was a note, added several years later, indicating that the building had been decommissioned and no longer in use. Nothing unusual, but as he continued, he found another entry. It was older, dated a few months before the building's construction. A request for survey work in the same area. The document was brief, lacking detail, but one line stood out. Site selected based on pre-existing foundation. Rook read it again. Pre-existing. He checked the accompanying map. It showed the same area, though less developed. The road was not yet there. The houses were fewer, and in the spot where the utility building would later stand, there was a small, unmarked square. No label, no explanation, just a shape. He made a copy of the document and returned the original to its place. When he stepped back into the main room, Irina looked up again. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Something like that," Rook said. She hesitated, then added, "Mara used to come in here sometimes. Not often, mostly for older records." "What kind of records?" "Land surveys, mostly." She asked about anything that had been changed. "Changed how?" Irina frowned slightly, as if trying to recall the exact wording. She said something about boundaries not matching, lines that didn't quite line up anymore. Rook considered this. Did she mention any specific locations? Irina shook her head. "Not to me, but she spent a long time looking at maps." Rook nodded. "Thank you." As he left the building, the afternoon had begun to soften. The light was warmer now, casting longer shadows across the street. He paused on the steps, taking a slow breath. Then he reached into his coat and unfolded the map he had found in the utility building. He looked at the two remaining marked points, one at the edge of the woods, one deeper in the hills. He traced the path between them with his finger, noting how it curved, how it followed the natural contours of the land rather than the roads, as if it had been there before the roads were built. He folded the map again and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he started walking. He did not take the road that most people use to reach the edge of town. Instead, he followed the line suggested by the map, letting it guide him through quieter spaces, narrow strips of land between properties, faint paths worn into the grass, where people passed without thinking, the backs of places rather than their fronts. The town thinned gradually. Houses gave way to wider yards, then to small stretches of open ground where the grass grew uneven and the soil showed through in pale patches. The air shifted as he walked, carrying fewer traces of people and more of the surrounding land. Pine, damp bark, something faintly mineral beneath it all. By the time he reached the edge of the woods, the sounds of the town had fallen away almost completely. There was a low fence marking the boundary, though it had gaps where the wood had warped and separated over time. A narrow opening had formed near one of the posts, just wide enough to pass through without effort. Rook stepped through and paused. The ground here was softer, layered with needles and leaves that muted his movement. The trees stood closer together than those near the clearing behind Mara's house, their trunks darker, their branches weaving a thicker cover overhead. Light filtered down in narrow strands, shifting slightly as the air moved. He took a few steps forward, then stopped again. There was a path. It was not obvious at first glance, but once seen, it was difficult to ignore. The undergrowth was thinner along a faint line that curved gently inward, the ground just slightly more compacted. He followed it. The path did not run straight. It bent and adjusted, sometimes narrowing until it was little more than a suggestion, then widening again into a clearer track. It felt less like something built and more like something that had been used repeatedly, over time, by people who did not leave much behind. After a while, the forest changed subtly. The trees grew older, their bark rougher, their roots more exposed. In places, the ground rose and fell in small, uneven slopes. The air felt cooler here, and the smell of damp earth was stronger. Rook noticed a sound, not distinct, but consistent, a slow, intermittent dripping, as if water were falling from a height and landing somewhere out of sight. He moved toward it. The path led him to a shallow depression in the land, where the ground dipped inward to form a small basin. At its center was a structure that might once have been a well. It was circular, built of stone, though many of the stones had shifted or fallen away. The opening was partially covered by a warped wooden lid, its surface darkened with age and moisture. The dripping sound came from within. Rook approached carefully and placed a hand on the edge of the structure. The stone was cold and slightly slick to the touch. He lifted the lid just enough to look inside. It was deeper than he expected. The interior walls were lined with stone, descending into darkness. A faint glimmer of water reflected far below, catching what little light filtered down. He listened. The dripping continued, slow and steady. Then, after a moment, he became aware of something else. A different kind of sound. Softer, not constant. A slight shift, as if something had moved just beyond the edge of hearing. He lowered the lid gently and stepped back. Near the base of the structure, partially obscured by leaves, he noticed something lying on the ground. It was a piece of fabric. He crouched and picked it up. Canvas. Worn, but familiar. It matched the material of Mara's tote bag. The edge was torn, the threads uneven, as if it had caught on something and been pulled free. Rook held it for a moment, then folded it carefully and placed it in his pocket. He stood and looked around the basin. There were no clear footprints, no obvious signs of disturbance. But the ground, in places, seemed slightly compressed, not in the defined shapes of steps, but in subtle, overlapping impressions, as if weight had been distributed carefully rather than placed in distinct points. He followed the edge of the depression slowly, letting his eyes move over the ground, the roots, the stones. On the far side, he found a narrow continuation of the path, leading upward again. He hesitated briefly, then followed it. The forest grew quieter as he moved deeper. Even the faint movement of air through the branches seemed to lessen, leaving a stillness that felt almost contained. After several minutes, the path brought him to a second clearing. This one was different from the first. There was no shed, no obvious structure. Instead, the ground had been disturbed in a more deliberate way. Several shallow trenches ran parallel to each other, their edges softened by time, but still visible. Between them, the earth was slightly raised, forming low ridges. Rook stepped closer. The pattern was too regular to be natural. He walked along one of the trenches, noting its length, its direction. It extended across the clearing, then disappeared into the undergrowth on the far side. Near the center, he saw something embedded in the soil, a small, rectangular object. He knelt and brushed away the dirt. It was a fragment of wood, smooth on one side, rough on the other. Faint markings were visible on the surface, not letters exactly, but lines intersecting at deliberate angles. He turned it in his hand. The markings resembled something he had seen before. He reached into his coat and took out the map. Comparing the two, he noticed that the lines on the wood fragment mirrored a portion of the hand-drawn map. Not exactly, but closely enough to suggest a connection. He looked back at the clearing, the trenches, the ridges, the way the space was arranged. It was not a map. but it was a representation of something. He stood slowly, the fragment still in his hand. At the edge of the clearing, where the path continued into denser trees, there was a small structure he had not noticed at first. It was low to the ground, partially concealed by branches and leaves. A kind of enclosure. He approached it. It was made of thin wooden slats, arranged in a rough frame, with gaps between them. Not large enough to enter comfortably, but not entirely sealed either. The wood was weathered, the surfaces worn smooth in places. He crouched beside it and looked inside. The interior was empty, save for a thin layer of leaves. But the leaves had been disturbed. Not recently, but not long ago either. He reached in and moved them aside gently. Beneath them, the ground was packed more tightly than the surrounding soil. And there, pressed into the surface, were impressions. Not footprints. Not quite. They were elongated, irregular, as if something had rested there without fully settling. He withdrew his hand and sat back on his heels. For a moment, he remained still, listening. The forest held its quiet. Then, faintly, from somewhere beyond the clearing, came the sound of movement. Not close, but not far. A soft brushing, like something passing through undergrowth with careful, measured steps. Rook stood slowly and turned toward the sound. He did not call out this time. He simply listened. The movement continued for a few seconds, then stopped. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. He waited, but nothing else came. After a while, he looked down at the fragment of wood in his hand, then back at the enclosure, the trenches, the path leading onward. The map in his pocket seemed to carry a quiet weight. There was still one marked point deeper in the hills. He slipped the fragment into his coat and took a step toward the path. Then another. The trees closed around him again as he moved forward, the light thinning, the air cooling, the forest drawing him further along a line that felt less like a direction and more like a continuation of something already in motion. The ground rose gradually beneath his feet, the incline so slight at first it felt more like a change in balance than elevation. The path narrowed, threading between older trees whose trunks bore faint scars, shallow lines and marks that did not follow any natural pattern. Some were straight, others angled, intersecting in ways that suggested intention without revealing purpose. Rook slowed as he passed them, his fingers brushing one of the marks. The surface of the bark was smoother along the line, as if it had been worn down over time rather than cut all at once. The forest held its quiet. He continued upward. After some distance, the trees began to thin again, not opening into a clearing, but spacing themselves just enough to allow more light through. The air felt different here, drier, with a faint, almost chalk-like scent that lingered at the back of his throat. The path led him to a stretch of exposed ground where the soil gave way to pale, compacted earth. Small stones were embedded in it, their surfaces worn smooth. At the center of this space stood a structure unlike the others he had seen. It was not a building, not exactly, for narrow posts had been set into the ground, forming a rough square. Between them, thin strands of wire had been stretched, crisscrossing at irregular intervals. Some of the strands had sagged over time, while others remained taut. There was no roof, no walls, just the frame. Rook approached slowly. The wires caught the light in faint glimmers, barely visible unless viewed at the right angle. As he moved around the structure, he noticed small pieces of material caught on them, threads of fabric, fragments of paper, even a few strands of hair. He stopped at one of the posts. Carved into the wood, near eye level, was a symbol. It resembled the markings on the fragment he had found in the clearing below, intersecting lines, forming a shape that suggested direction rather than meaning. He took the fragment from his pocket and held it up beside the carving. They aligned. Not perfectly, but enough. A continuation. He stepped inside the frame. The ground within the posts felt slightly different underfoot, firmer, as if it had been pressed down repeatedly. There were faint impressions there, overlapping and indistinct, much like those he had seen before. At the center, a small object lay partially buried in the soil. He crouched and uncovered it. It was a key, old, made of darkened metal, its surface worn smooth with use. The bow was simple, unadorned, but the shaft bore fine scratches, as if it had been turned in a lock many times. Rook turned it in his hand. There was no immediate indication of what it belonged to. He slipped it into his coat. As he stood, he noticed something beyond the frame. A narrow structure, partially concealed by the trees. It stood at the edge of the rise, where the land began to slope downward again on the other side. From a distance, it appeared almost like a small outbuilding, but as he moved closer, its shape became clearer. It was a stairwell, built into the ground. Concrete walls rose on either side of a set of narrow steps that descended into darkness. A metal railing ran along one side, its surface rusted in places. At the top, a simple doorframe stood, though no door remained. The air that drifted up from below was cool and carried a faint, enclosed smell, dust, stone, something older beneath it. Rook paused at the edge. He listened. No sound came from within. He began to descend. Each step produced a soft, hollow echo, the sound contained by the walls. The light faded quickly as he moved downward, replaced by a dim, diffuse glow that seemed to come from somewhere below rather than above. At the bottom, the stairs opened into a corridor. The space was narrow, the ceiling low enough that he had to tilt his head slightly as he moved forward. The walls were bare concrete, their surfaces marked by faint discolorations and hairline cracks. The air was still. He moved slowly, his footsteps measured. Along the right-hand wall, a series of metal doors were set at regular intervals. Each one was closed, their surfaces dull with age. Small rectangular slots were positioned at eye level, though they were too dark to see through clearly. Rook approached the first door and tried the handle. It did not move. The second was the same. At the third, the handle turned slightly, but the door remained shut, as if something on the other side held it in place. He moved on. At the end of the corridor, the space opened into a larger room. It was empty, save for a single table positioned near the center. The table was made of wood, its surface worn smooth. On it lay a stack of papers, arranged with careful precision. Rook approached. The top sheet bore familiar handwriting. Alignment requires repetition. He read it once, then set it aside. The pages beneath contained more notes, fragments of observations, lists of names, sketches of shapes and patterns. Some of the names he recognized from the school records. Others were unfamiliar. Alan Veres appeared frequently, not just as a name, but as a point of reference. In one note, the name was written several times in a column, each instance slightly altered, a letter changed, a spacing adjusted, as if someone had been testing variations. Rook flipped to another page. It contained a rough diagram of the town, similar to the map he had found earlier, but more detailed. Lines extended outward from the marked points, connecting them in ways that formed a larger pattern. The bus stop, the shed, the utility building, the well, the clearing with the trenches, the frame on the hill, and here, all linked. At the center of the diagram was a small circle, unlabeled. He studied it for a moment, then looked up. The room extended beyond the table, its far wall partially obscured by shadow. As his eyes adjusted, he made out the outline of another doorway. He moved toward it. Beyond the doorway was a second corridor, narrower than the first. The walls here were different, not smooth concrete, but lined with wooden panels, their surfaces worn and darkened. The air carried a faint scent of paper and something else, something dry and brittle. Halfway down, he saw a light, a soft, steady glow emanating from a room at the end of the corridor. He approached slowly. The light came from a single lamp placed on a desk. The room itself was small, its walls lined with shelves filled with files and boxes. The arrangement was meticulous, each item labeled in careful handwriting. At the desk sat a woman. Her back was to him. She was still, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the surface in front of her. For a moment, Rook did not move. The quiet in the room felt complete. Then, very slowly, the woman spoke. "You're not following the lines exactly." Her voice was calm, even, as if continuing a conversation that had already begun. Rook stepped forward once, stopping just inside the doorway. "Mara," he said. She did not turn. "The spacing matters," she continued softly. "If you shift even slightly, it doesn't hold." Rook glanced at the desk. Spread across it were more maps, more diagrams, each one layered over the next, forming a dense network of lines and points. "You left your bag," he said. A pause. "I couldn't carry everything," she replied. Her fingers moved slightly, adjusting a sheet of paper by a fraction of an inch. "The records don't stay where they're placed," she went on. "They move, or something moves them. It's slow. Most people don't notice." Rook took another step forward. "You came here," he said. "Yes." "And then what?" Another pause. She reached for a pencil and drew a short line on the paper in front of her, connecting 2 points. "I'm still here," she said. The lamp flickered faintly, then steadied. Rook stood in the doorway, the quiet pressing in around them, the layers of paper and lines and names stretching out across the desk, as if the room itself were holding them in place. Rook remained silent for a moment, letting the calm of the room settle over him. The quiet was heavier here than anywhere else. The faint hum of the lamp, the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath his shoes, the way the air seemed almost charged with intention. Every movement, however small, carried weight. He finally stepped fully into the room, careful not to disturb the papers. Mara's head was still down, her hand tracing a line between 2 points on one of the maps. The line was delicate, precise, almost imperceptible, yet it connected 2 locations that he recognized from earlier: the clearing with the shallow trenches and the frame on the hill. He crouched slightly to inspect the edges of the desk. There were faint indentations in the wood, impressions left by long-removed objects. He ran a finger along one groove and felt a subtle vibration, almost like the grain of the desk had shifted in a pattern. He traced it slowly, noting that it aligned roughly with the points Mara had just connected. "Why here?" he asked, voice low. "Why this room?" She finally lifted her head, her expression calm but focused. Her eyes were sharp, observing. "This room is steady. Everything else shifts," she said. "You have to have a reference point." He glanced around, noticing the subtle details he hadn't before. The shelves, each labeled in careful handwriting. Small boxes tucked into corners, some slightly ajar, revealing fragments of folded paper. The faint smell of dry leaves mixed with dust and aged wood. On one shelf, a small stack of envelopes leaned slightly to the side, their edges worn. He pulled one down. Inside was a series of photographs, black and white, depicting sections of Brindle Hollow, streets, buildings, patches of forest. all marked with tiny annotations in the same precise handwriting. "These are recent?" he asked, flipping through them carefully. The edges were crisp, the paper not yellowed. "Yes," she said. They traced the patterns, past and present. Rook set the photographs back down and rose slowly, looking toward a corner of the room he hadn't noticed before. There was a narrow door, partially obscured by a shelf. The handle was small and unassuming, but worn in a way that suggested repeated use. He gestured toward it. "This leads where?" "Further," she said simply. "You follow the connections. Eventually they lead somewhere. Not the end. Not yet." He nodded and approached. The door swung open with a quiet creak, revealing a narrow staircase spiraling downward. The walls were stone now, cool to the touch, with small patches of moss in the cracks. The air smelled faintly of damp earth and minerals, heavier the further he descended. Each step echoed softly, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the enclosed space. Rook moved deliberately, listening for anything unusual, a shift in air, a whisper of movement, a sound out of place. The staircase ended in a small chamber, roughly circular, its ceiling low and uneven. The room contained a series of shallow alcoves carved into the walls. In each, objects were arranged with careful precision: fragments of paper, small tools, lengths of string, and faintly rusted nails. The arrangement suggested care and intention rather than chaos. He crouched to examine one alcove. Inside lay a folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. The writing was faded but still legible, a combination of letters and symbols he did not immediately recognize. He traced the lines lightly with his fingertip, feeling the impressions pressed into the surface. Mara moved silently to another alcove, adjusting the position of a small bundle of papers. "Patterns repeat," she said. "Even when removed, they leave traces. You can follow them if you know how to look." Rook stood and observed the chamber. The walls themselves seemed to carry the history of movement. Faint scratches, shallow depressions, irregularities in the stone that suggested the passage of something small and deliberate, again and again over time. He noticed a narrow tunnel at the far side of the chamber, partially hidden behind a projection of stone. It was just wide enough to move through. The entrance was dark, but a faint line of light appeared deeper inside, suggesting another opening. He turned to Mara. "You've been here before?" "Yes," she said. "More than once. But the light changes. The way it falls tells you where to step, what to follow." He glanced down at the ground. The floor was uneven, with small depressions and subtle ridges. He realized that even without seeing, he could sense a path, a suggestion of direction embedded in the contours of the stone. He began to follow the tunnel. The air became cooler, heavier, carrying a faint metallic scent beneath the earthy tones. Occasionally, he paused to examine a mark on the wall or the floor, a faint scratch, a worn spot, a tiny smear of something dark. Each seemed insignificant alone, but together they hinted at a deliberate progression. After several minutes, the tunnel opened into a small chamber illuminated by a narrow slit in the ceiling. Dust motes floated in the light, drifting lazily, settling slowly onto the surfaces below. On the floor, he noticed a faint grid, shallow lines etched into the stone, intersecting at precise angles. Mara knelt beside it. "Alignment," she whispered. "The connections must meet here. Everything else radiates outward." He crouched beside her, examining the grid. The marks corresponded faintly to the diagrams he had seen earlier, but this was the first time he could feel them spatially, not just conceptually. Each line, each intersection, seemed to guide movement, placement, and thought. "Has anyone else been here?" he asked. She shook her head. "Not for years. Maybe decades. Most don't notice. Most wouldn't know what to look for." Rook studied the chamber, the tunnel, the faint light, the etched grid. The quiet pressed in around him, heavy and deliberate, yet there was a rhythm to it, subtle but undeniable. Each mark, each shadow, each hint of movement seemed to speak if one paused long enough to notice. He rose slowly, careful not to disturb anything, and stood at the entrance to the tunnel. Beyond, the forest waited, faint lights spilling in through distant trees. Each step back would retrace the path they had taken, but he felt now that every movement mattered. Every observation could become a clue if noted carefully. Mara rose as well, adjusting a piece of paper in her hands. "We continue," she said. "There's one more point." Rook nodded, feeling the slow accumulation of knowledge pressing gently against the edges of his understanding. The mystery had deepened, and the path ahead was still quiet, winding, and unhurried. The forest beyond the tunnel seemed to welcome them back, carrying hints of wind, faint scents of earth and pine, and the promise of further discovery. They emerged from the tunnel into a narrow ravine, the trees here leaning inward as though listening. Sunlight sifted through the high branches in pale, angled beams, striking patches of moss that clung to exposed roots and damp earth. The air was cool, carrying the faint metallic scent of iron mingled with the sweetness of decaying leaves. Each step made the ground softly sigh beneath their weight. Rook followed Mara, noting the subtle changes in the terrain. Small depressions, shallow ridges, and broken twigs formed a kind of map underfoot, not obvious, but perceptible if one looked closely. He realized that the path they walked had been used recently, though by whom, he could not tell. The traces were careful, deliberate, almost measured. After a few minutes, they reached a small creek. The water ran quietly over rounded stones, its surface broken occasionally by fallen leaves drifting along in the current. The banks were low, bordered by thick clumps of ferns and moss, and the soil was soft, almost spongy. Mara stepped onto a partially submerged log and carefully crossed, testing its stability before committing her weight. Rook followed, his boots sending tiny splashes into the shallow water. As he reached the other side, he noticed something tucked beneath the roots of a large alder tree. A small, rectangular wooden box, darkened by moisture, partially hidden by leaves. He bent and picked it up. Its surface was worn and slightly warped, the lid sealed by a simple latch. There were no markings, but the wood carried a faint, almost imperceptible pattern, scratches that seemed to form a series of lines and intersections, reminiscent of the etched grid in the underground chamber. He opened it carefully. Inside lay a bundle of papers, tied together with a thin piece of string. Each sheet bore meticulous handwriting, notes, diagrams, and sketches. Some of the symbols matched those he had seen in the chamber, while others were entirely new, unfamiliar, angular, precise. Mara knelt beside him, peering at the contents. "Each discovery adds another layer," she said quietly. "Everything here connects, even when it doesn't seem like it." Rook flipped through a sheet. One section contained rough sketches of rooftops, alleyways, and forest paths near Brindle Hollow. Another had notations next to faint lines, resembling the ridges he had noticed in the clearing with the frame. And again, the name Alan Varys appeared, often accompanied by dates that did not correspond with any official record. He replaced the papers and lifted the box, noting its weight and how carefully it had been positioned beneath the roots. Whoever had left it intended it to remain unnoticed, yet accessible to someone who knew where to look. They continued along the creek, the path rising gradually. The ground became firmer, interspersed with scattered stones, patches of exposed tree roots, and narrow clearings where sunlight fell in geometric shapes. Birds called faintly, but their sounds were distant, muted by the thick canopy above. After a stretch, the trees opened to reveal a small clearing dominated by a single, wide tree whose bark was deeply grooved. Around its base, the ground had been flattened as if something large had been repeatedly placed there. Rook noticed faint lines in the soil, intersecting at angles that mirrored the grids he had seen underground and on the wooden fragment. He crouched, brushing a few leaves aside. There were impressions, not distinct footprints, but subtle depressions indicating weight distributed in deliberate patterns. Near the tree's trunk, partially hidden in a hollow, was a small bundle of twine. He picked it up and examined it. The fibers were rough, frayed at the ends, and carried traces of soil and moss. Mara reached down and took a pencil from her pocket, marking a point in a small notebook she had retrieved earlier. "Patterns repeat here," she said softly. "Connections often lie where you least expect them. You have to feel the space, not just see it." Rook looked around the clearing, letting his eyes move over the subtle ridges, depressions, and natural features. Each element seemed intentional, part of a larger structure he could only sense in fragments. Beyond the clearing, the land sloped upward toward a low rise, where the forest became denser again. The path narrowed, twisting between gnarled roots and fallen branches. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying a damp, earthy scent mixed with the faint trace of something metallic. Along the way, Rook noticed a small rock formation on the side of the path. One stone, larger than the others, bore faint scratches, shallow, intersecting lines, almost imperceptible unless viewed from the right angle. He knelt and traced them lightly with a fingertip. The pattern resonated with the other marks he had found, suggesting continuity, repetition. Mara stopped beside him, pointing toward a subtle opening in the trees above the rise. A narrow beam of light shone through, illuminating the base of another low structure hidden in shadow. Its walls were rough-hewn timber, darkened with age. A doorframe was visible, but no door remained. He rose and approached it slowly. The structure exuded quiet age. The faint scent of old wood, moss, and soil seeped from its cracks. He pressed his hand against the surface, feeling the irregularities in the grain, the grooves and lines that hinted at repeated contact over time. Inside, the floor was bare earth, uneven and soft. Along one wall, a series of shallow indentations suggested that objects had been placed here, removed, and replaced many times. Small fragments of paper and twigs lay scattered, almost invisible. Rook picked up one fragment, a tiny piece of parchment with a single line of handwriting, partially faded. The point beyond must remain observed. He set it aside carefully. As he moved deeper into the structure, he noticed another opening at the back, a narrow path leading downward toward darkness. The faint smell of damp stone and earth became stronger. He paused, listening to the stillness. Nothing moved, yet the air felt dense with intention, as though each stone, each mark, each shadow had been placed deliberately. Mara stepped forward beside him. "This is the last stretch," she said. "The final point is nearby, but it is different. You need to observe carefully." Rook nodded, feeling the slow weight of the investigation pressing against him. Each step, each observation, every subtle clue, layered upon the last. drawing him deeper into a network of patterns that spanned time, space, and memory. Together, they moved forward along the path, into the quiet darkness, where the forest, the hidden chambers, and the small, deliberate traces of someone's meticulous work awaited the next discovery. They moved slowly down the narrow path, the darkness gradually giving way to dim light, filtering through gaps in the trees. The forest seemed to ease around them, the air cooler but less dense, carrying the scent of earth and fallen leaves without the oppressive weight that had clung to the lower tunnels. Rook's mind traced the pattern of discoveries they had made. The maps, the grids, the shallow trenches, the careful marks in the forest and the underground chambers. Each location had been deliberate, each object placed or left as if to guide someone along a quiet trail. He began to see how the fragments fit together, not randomly, not maliciously, but intentionally, almost as though someone had been building a record of movement, a map of connections, rather than a trap. Mara stopped at a slight rise, where the path flattened and opened onto a small plateau. From here, the last point marked on the original map was visible, an old, abandoned observation platform, simple and wooden, raised slightly above the ground to overlook the surrounding forest. The structure was weathered, but intact, its boards darkened by years of rain and sun. Rook approached it slowly. The platform was quiet, still, and empty. He noted the subtle details, the slight tilt of the boards, the small depressions worn into the steps, faint scratch marks along the railing. Everything bore the trace of careful, repeated use. He turned to Mara. "All the points lead here," he said quietly. "Yes," she replied. Her eyes scanned the clearing, the platform, the surrounding forest. "But it isn't about where it ends. It's about what connects the points. The lines, the patterns, the way someone observed the space over time." Rook looked at the platform again. He realized that the marks, the grids, the subtle signs scattered through Brindle Hollow had been a record, not a crime scene in the traditional sense, but a meticulously maintained map of a space that had meaning to someone, something to observe, to track, and to preserve. He knelt to examine the base of the platform. Small fragments of paper, twigs, and faint impressions in the soil suggested repeated visits. The patterns mirrored those he had seen in the underground chamber, in the clearing, and even in the wooden fragment. Not threatening, not violent, but deliberate, reflective. "I think," he began slowly, "all of this, it's documentation. A system, a record of movement and alignment. Whoever left these marks wasn't hiding someone. They were recording, mapping, observing." Mara nodded. "Exactly. Alan varies. He wasn't trying to harm anyone. He was trying to preserve something he thought important, something that most people would never notice. The points, the structures, the grids, they were his way of marking continuity, keeping a thread of understanding across time." Rook stood, taking in the plateau, the platform, the surrounding forest. The sun had shifted, casting gentle light across the clearing, illuminating moss, bark, and stone. The lines, the subtle signs, the careful placement of objects, all of it began to make quiet sense. It was a system, not a trap, an effort to keep history, to note shifts, to ensure that the subtle connections in Brindle Hollow would not be forgotten. He exhaled slowly. The tension that had accompanied each step, each discovery, softened. The pattern, the repetition, the faintly unsettling marks, they were understandable now, comprehensible within the context of observation rather than malice. Mara stepped onto the platform, her hands resting lightly on the railing. "He wanted someone to notice eventually," she said. To follow the lines and see what was happening. Not to solve a crime, but to understand it. To preserve it. Rook nodded, looking over the forest and the path they had taken. Every subtle indentation, every mark, every paper fragment now felt like a quiet message across time. Not a mystery that demanded punishment, but a record that demanded attention. The wind stirred gently through the trees. The sunlight shifted again, softening the shadows. The forest exhaled, and for the first time, Rook felt the calm that had eluded him throughout the investigation. He turned back toward Mara, who was still looking out across the trees. "Do you think we'll ever know everything?" he asked. "Not everything," she said, "but enough. Enough to understand what was intended, and that's what matters." They stood there together, quiet, letting the forest and the plateau settle around them. The path behind them remained, marked in faint, deliberate ways, but now those marks felt less like secrets and more like guidance. A slow, steady thread that connected the points, the places, the observations, a gentle conclusion drawn across time. Understood at last. Rook exhaled, letting the calm sink in fully. The sun moved slowly westward, and the shadows shifted, softening the plateau and the forest. The mystery, once tense and elusive, had settled into clarity, not dramatic, not abrupt, but complete in its quiet, steady way. He stepped lightly off the platform, following Mara back toward the path. Each step felt measured, deliberate, in harmony with the space around them. And as they walked, the forest seemed to breathe with them, serene and patient, the subtle patterns of Brindle Hollow finally, quietly understood. Case 2. The first thing anyone noticed was the sound. Not a scream, not a crash, just the steady, hollow tapping of a metal mailbox door swinging gently in the morning wind. It struck the wooden post once every few seconds. Soft, repetitive, almost patient. At 6:42 a.m., the road along Larkspur Bend was still mostly quiet. A pale mist clung low to the ground, rising from the marsh beyond the tree line. The air carried the smell of damp earth and cold iron, the kind that lingered in the back of the throat. Somewhere farther off, a dog barked once and then went silent again. The mailbox belonged to Evelyn Maris. She had walked out to it every morning for the past 11 years, always at the same time, always in the same order. Kettle on first. Then the curtains opened halfway, never fully. Then her shoes, soft-soled and gray. Then the mailbox. But on that morning, the mailbox door was already open, and Evelyn was nowhere in sight. Understood. It wasn't unusual for the road to be empty, even at that hour. Larkspur Bend was not the kind of place people passed through without reason. The road curved in on itself, looping past a narrow stretch of houses before dissolving into a gravel trail that led nowhere in particular. Most of the homes were spaced too far apart for casual conversation, and the trees, tall, thin pines, absorbed sound in a way that made everything feel more distant than it really was. Evelyn's house sat slightly back from the road, its pale siding dulled by years of rain. A small wooden fence framed the front yard, though the gate was rarely closed. The grass was uneven, growing in quiet patches that suggested more patience than care. The mailbox stood at the edge of the property, leaning slightly to the left, still tapping. When her neighbor, Thomas E. Vare, stepped outside that morning, he noticed the sound almost immediately. He paused on his porch, one hand resting on the railing, listening without quite knowing why. Tap. A pause. Tap. He squinted toward the road, trying to see through the thin veil of fog. The shape of the mailbox emerged first, then the suggestion of movement, the door shifting back and forth in the breeze. He frowned. Evelyn was always precise. The kind of person who closed doors gently, who folded receipts before placing them in a drawer. A swinging mailbox door didn't fit. He stepped down from his porch slowly, his shoes brushing softly against the gravel path. The air felt colder than usual, though the sky was clear above the mist. As he approached the edge of his property, he noticed something else. The front door of Evelyn's house was open, not wide, just enough to leave a thin line of darkness visible inside. Thomas stopped walking. For a moment, he simply stood there, listening. No movement, no voices, no sound from within the house. Just the mailbox. Tap, tap. By 7:15 a.m., the road had begun to stir in small, hesitant ways. A car passed once, its tires hissing quietly over the damp pavement. A figure walked a dog farther down the bend, though they did not come close enough to notice anything unusual. Thomas had not gone inside the house. He had walked as far as the mailbox, placed a hand on its cold metal surface, and gently closed the door. It clicked into place with a soft, final sound. Then he turned toward the house, hesitated, and stepped back again. There was no immediate reason to assume anything was wrong. People left doors open. Sometimes, people forgot things. But Evelyn didn't forget things. At 7:23 a.m., Thomas called the local sheriff's office. Deputy Mara Elkin arrived just before 8. Her car moved slowly along the bend, headlights still on despite the growing light. She parked a short distance from the house and stepped out, the door closing with a muted thud. She stood for a moment, taking in the scene. The open gate, the uneven grass, the front door still slightly ajar, and the mailbox, now closed but not quite aligned. She noticed that immediately. It sat just slightly off-center, as if it had been moved and not returned to its exact position. The kind of detail most people would overlook, but Mara had spent enough time in quiet places to recognize when something small felt wrong. Thomas approached her from across the road, his steps measured, his expression uncertain. "She wasn't there," he said, before Mara could ask anything. "I didn't go inside, just saw the door." Mara nodded. "You said the mailbox was open?" "Yes, swinging." She glanced at it again. "And you closed it?" "I didn't think." He paused, then shook his head. "I just didn't think." "That's fine," Mara said gently. She turned toward the house. The wooden steps creaked softly under her weight as she approached the front door. The air inside felt cooler, carrying a faint scent of something metallic, subtle, almost indistinct. She pushed the door open a little further. The interior was dim, the curtains drawn halfway across the windows. A thin line of morning light cut across the floor, illuminating dust motes that drifted slowly in the still air. "Ms. Maris?" she called. No response. She stepped inside. The house was quiet in a way that felt deliberate. Not empty, not abandoned, just paused. The kitchen lay directly ahead, the kettle still resting on the stove. It was cold to the touch. Beside it, a mug sat on the counter, a tea bag draped over the edge, its string hanging down like a loose thread. Mara moved carefully, her footsteps soft against the worn wooden floor. Everything appeared in order. A chair slightly pulled out from the table, a folded newspaper resting beside it, a pair of glasses placed neatly on top. No signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass, just small interruptions. She noticed the back door next. It was closed, but not latched. She approached it slowly, her fingers brushing against the handle. When she pushed, it opened without resistance. The yard beyond stretched into the thin line of trees, the grass darker there, damp from the lingering mist. A narrow path led away from the house, barely visible beneath a layer of fallen pine needles. Mara stepped outside. The air smelled different here, sharper. There was something else beneath the scent of wet earth, something faint and unfamiliar, like old paper or fabric left too long in a closed space. She followed the path a few steps. Then she stopped. Something lay just off to the side, partially hidden beneath a low branch. A shoe, gray, soft-soled. Mara crouched beside it. It matched the pair Thomas had described. She looked around. The ground showed no obvious signs of disturbance. No deep impressions, no broken branches. Just the quiet, undisturbed surface of damp soil and scattered needles. Too undisturbed. She stood slowly, her gaze moving further along the path. It continued into the trees, narrowing as it went, until it disappeared entirely into shadow. By mid-morning, the house had filled with quiet activity. 2 additional deputies moved carefully through the rooms, documenting, observing, speaking in low tones. Outside, a strip of tape marked the boundary of the property, though it fluttered gently in the breeze, more symbolic than restrictive. Mara stood near the edge of the yard, looking toward the trees. Thomas remained nearby, though he kept his distance now, his presence subdued. "She didn't have family," he said after a while. "Not that I knew of." Mara nodded, though she didn't turn. "She ever leave? For long periods?" "No, not really." He hesitated. She kept to herself, but not in a strange way, just quiet. Mara glanced back toward the house. Anyone visit her recently? Thomas thought for a moment. There was someone, maybe a week ago. He frowned slightly, as if trying to recall a detail that didn't quite want to surface. "A car I didn't recognize. Parked out front." "What kind of car?" "I don't know. Dark. Maybe blue." "Did you see the driver?" "No." Mara returned her attention to the trees. The path still seemed unchanged. Still calm. Still wrong. They searched the woods that afternoon, not in a frantic way, but methodically, measured steps, careful observation, the kind of search that relied more on patience than urgency. The path led deeper than it appeared from the yard, winding slightly as it moved between the trees. The ground softened in places, the soil darker, holding faint impressions that might have been footprints, but too faint to confirm. About 50 yards in, they found something else. A piece of paper, folded once. It rested against the base of a tree, dry despite the damp surroundings, as if it had been placed there rather than dropped. Mara picked it up carefully. There was no writing on the outside. She unfolded it slowly. Inside, a single line had been written in careful, deliberate handwriting. It wasn't supposed to be opened. Mara stared at it for a long moment. The words felt less like a message and more like a statement. Detached, almost reflective. She looked around again, the quiet of the woods pressing in gently from all sides. No movement, no sound, just the faint rustle of branches overhead. The investigation continued over the following days, though nothing about it moved quickly. Evelyn's disappearance settled into the rhythm of the town in a subtle way. Conversations grew quieter. People paused a little longer when passing her house. The mailbox remained closed, though no one seemed to remember closing it again. Inside, the house revealed little. No signs of forced entry. No indication of a struggle. Her belongings remained untouched, arranged in the same careful order she had maintained for years. But there were small things. A drawer in the bedroom that contained nothing but neatly stacked envelopes, each one empty. A photograph tucked behind a mirror, showing a younger Evelyn standing beside a man whose face had been partially obscured by a fold in the paper. And the newspaper, it had been dated 3 days earlier, folded to an article that no longer seemed particularly relevant. Mara returned to the woods alone on the 4th day. The air had grown warmer, the mist no longer clinging to the ground in the same way. The path felt more visible now, though no more comforting. She walked slowly, retracing the route they had taken before. The tree where the note had been found stood unchanged. She paused beside it. Then she looked further ahead. There was something she hadn't noticed before. A slight deviation in the ground. Not a path, exactly. Just a shift in the pattern of the needles, as if something had passed through without fully disturbing the surface. She followed it. It led a short distance off the main trail, curving gently between 2 closely spaced trees. And then it ended, at a small clearing. There was nothing there. No objects, no markings, no sign of activity. Just a quiet, open space where the light filtered through the branches in a soft, diffused pattern. Mara stepped into the center of it. The air felt still, heavier. She turned slowly, taking in the edges of the clearing. And then she noticed it. At the base of one of the trees, partially buried beneath the soil, was the corner of something rectangular. She knelt and brushed the dirt away carefully. A small wooden box, weathered but intact. She lifted it gently. It was lighter than she expected. The lid was not locked. She opened it. Inside, there was nothing but a single key. And another note. She unfolded it with the same careful motion as before. The handwriting was the same. You weren't meant to follow. Mara closed her eyes briefly, then opened them again. The woods remained quiet, unchanged, but something had shifted. Not in the environment, in the understanding. Evelyn hadn't simply disappeared. She had left something behind. Not a trail, not evidence. Something quieter, something that waited. And for the first time, Mara considered the possibility that the disappearance was not an absence at all, but a continuation, one that had not yet finished unfolding. Mara stayed in the clearing longer than she intended. The soft brush of wind moved the branches above, stirring the needles so that they whispered against one another. A bird called somewhere far off, a single, hesitant note that seemed swallowed almost immediately by the trees. She shifted the key gently between her fingers, feeling the smooth weight of it, and wondered what it could unlock, or whether it was meant to be symbolic, a quiet gesture rather than a practical tool. She didn't move immediately back toward the house. Instead, she followed a faint path of pressed grass that led away from the clearing, winding around a small rise. The incline was subtle, but enough that she could see over the edge once she reached the top. Below, a narrow stream caught the sunlight, the water dark but reflective, moving lazily along its shallow bed. A thin trail of smoke, or perhaps mist, rose from the far side of the water, curling upward in slow spirals. It wasn't smoke from fire, not exactly, more like a faint haze clinging to the wet earth. Mara knelt by the bank, brushing aside fallen leaves. She noticed a few footprints, shallow and partially erased, leading toward a small, dilapidated boathouse. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its boards faded and cracked, but the roof appeared intact. A tangle of weeds had grown along the edges, and the door was ajar, swinging gently with the faintest breeze. She paused at the water's edge, listening. There was no sound of movement inside, just the muted drip of water against the boards, the occasional sigh of wind through broken shutters, and the faint hum of something unplaceable, almost like the air itself was holding its breath. Inside, the boathouse smelled of old wood, wet moss, and something faintly metallic beneath it, echoing the scent she had noticed back at Evelyn's home. There were objects left in quiet disarray. A paddle leaned against the far wall, a small tin box sat on a low shelf, and a coil of rope lay neatly in a corner. Mara approached the tin box. It was unmarked and had no lock. Inside, she found a few items: a folded piece of fabric, gray and soft like the shoes they had found, and a small envelope sealed with plain wax. She hesitated, running her finger along the seal before opening it. Inside was a photograph, carefully folded. It showed Evelyn standing beside a narrow path, the trees rising behind her in the same misty, muted light Mara remembered from the morning. "Well," she said slowly, "there was a man who came in a few days ago. Kept to himself mostly. Didn't order much, just coffee. Dark hair. Not from around here, I don't think. Stayed a long time, though. Sat in the corner. Wrote something, I think. I didn't look." Mara thanked her and sipped her own coffee, letting the warmth fill her hands. She tried to picture the man, the way he might have moved through town, and the subtle ways he could intersect with Evelyn's routine. But it was all fragments, impressions that refused to form a coherent shape. Later, she walked the sidewalk slowly, observing the details she might have missed before. A mail slot with a thin scratch along the metal, a loose brick along the diner's front step, the faint smell of pine wafting from a patch of overgrown bushes between two houses. Each detail was minor, almost trivial, but they felt like pieces of a larger pattern, one that she was only beginning to sense. Returning to Evelyn's house that evening, Mara found that the mailbox had shifted again. It leaned slightly more to the left than before, as if it had been nudged. The front door remained closed this time, but the faint scent of damp iron lingered near the threshold. She lingered by the yard, observing the small movements of shadow across the fence posts, the rustle of leaves under a passing bird. Inside, the house seemed unchanged, yet the stillness felt heavier. Mara moved through the room slowly, touching surfaces, opening drawers, noting the absence of disturbance. On the bedroom dresser, she found another envelope, tucked behind a small stack of photographs she hadn't noticed before. It was addressed to no one. The handwriting was unfamiliar, angular, precise. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single sentence. Some doors are meant to be left half open. She sat on the edge of the bed, holding the note, and let her eyes drift to the window. The light outside had softened, casting long shadows across the walls. The familiar shapes of furniture, of knickknacks arranged in deliberate calm, now seemed charged with anticipation. It was as if the house itself was aware of observation, waiting for Mara to notice something subtle enough to shift the narrative. The following morning, she ventured back to the woods, this time taking a route along the stream she had discovered near the boathouse. The water shimmered under pale light, and the air smelled faintly of moss and wet pine. Halfway along the bank, she noticed a flat stone, partially submerged, with scratches that might have been symbols or the erosion of time. She stayed for a while, listening to the rustle of leaves, the gentle flow of water, the faint creak of branches in the breeze. Every sound felt deliberate, every pause charged with unspoken meaning. Then, as the light shifted in the early afternoon, she left the clearing, making her way back along the stream, her mind cataloging each detail, each quiet, imperceptible clue that Evelyn, or whoever had left these traces, had created along the way. The mystery remained unsolved, but Mara felt, more clearly than before, that each discovery was connected. That Evelyn's disappearance was not chaos, but a sequence of careful movements, a slow, methodical path that waited for someone observant enough to follow. And she intended to follow it, one quiet step at a time. The following morning, Mara returned to Larkspur Bend before dawn. The air was damp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and earth, softened by a light fog that clung low to the ground. The town was still. Only the distant hum of the highway hinted at movement beyond the bend. She parked near the edge of the woods and stepped out, boots pressing into soft soil, leaving footprints that would quickly disappear under the creeping mist. Her first stop was the small abandoned railway line that ran along the eastern edge of town. Rusted tracks stretched into the fog, their wooden ties damp and moss-covered. Mara ran her fingers over the metal, feeling its cold texture, and noticed small scratches along one side, almost like they had been made by something sharp dragging over the surface. She crouched, examining them more closely. They weren't random. There was a pattern, a subtle sequence, faint but deliberate, as though someone had marked the ties in slow, methodical motion. A little farther down, the ground sloped into a shallow ditch, partially obscured by overgrown grass and scattered leaves. She moved carefully, brushing aside debris until she found a thin, bent rod of metal, no longer than a forearm. It had no obvious function, but it bore the same faint scratches as the tracks, similar to the marks she had seen earlier. Mara pocketed it. The way these traces repeated suggested an unseen hand guiding her attention, or perhaps warning her of something she had yet to understand. When she returned to town, the diner was quieter than the previous day. The waitress smiled faintly when she saw Mara enter. "Back so soon?" she asked softly. "Just looking around," Mara replied. "Did you notice anything else unusual the other day?" The waitress hesitated, cleaning a coffee cup slowly. "Well, I did see something. Not a person exactly. More like a movement. A shadow. It was late afternoon. Down by the old mill, near the creek. Didn't stick around. Just there, then gone." Mara's attention sharpened. The old mill had been abandoned for years, its water wheel still in place, half-rotted boards creaking with the wind. Few people ventured there. That it had been observed at all felt significant. She thanked the waitress and left, letting the quiet din of the diner fade behind her. By late afternoon, Mara had made her way to the mill. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the roof, casting thin, angled lines across the floor. Dust hung in the air, catching the light. She stepped carefully, listening to the creak of boards beneath her boots, and moved toward the back where the creek ran shallow and clear. There, she noticed small, deliberate piles of pebbles. Each was stacked carefully, some no more than 3 or 4 stones high. The arrangement felt too intentional to be natural, too precise to have been left by chance. Mara crouched beside one pile and examined it. A faint imprint in the damp soil suggested a hand, or perhaps a foot, had pressed lightly beside it, then lifted without disturbing the stack. She traced the edge with her gloved finger, noting the direction it suggested, toward a narrow opening in the undergrowth, where the creek disappeared beneath a tangle of brambles. Mara followed the creek slowly, pushing aside branches and stepping over roots. The world around her felt hushed, as though the forest itself waited in anticipation. The faint sound of water moving over rocks was steady, comforting in its consistency, yet carried an undercurrent of something unusual, an almost imperceptible rhythm she couldn't place. After 10 minutes, she reached a bend in the creek where the water pooled slightly deeper, reflecting the sky like a dark mirror. On the opposite bank, partially hidden by tall grass, Mara saw a small, rectangular object. She waded carefully across the shallow water, noting the change in temperature as the water lapped over her boots, and retrieved it. It was a wooden writing slate, the surface worn smooth but bearing faint chalk marks. The symbols were indecipherable at first glance, fragmented lines that suggested letters or shapes, but not a coherent word. She ran her fingers over the surface, noting the rhythm of the indentations, as if someone had been practicing careful, deliberate strokes. Returning to her car, Mara reflected on the day's findings. The scratches on the tracks, the bent rod, the stacked stones, and the slate, each subtle, each deliberate, hinted at a methodical presence moving quietly through familiar spaces. Evelyn's disappearance no longer seemed confined to the house or the immediate surroundings. The traces extended outward, into the forgotten and overlooked parts of town. That evening, Mara walked Larkspur Bend again, slower this time, observing details she might have missed before. The soft sway of the mailbox, the way the lamplight caught the edges of leaves along the fence line, the faint whisper of wind through the pines. At the edge of the woods, she noticed a patch of soil that looked slightly disturbed, darker than the surrounding earth. Kneeling, she brushed it gently, revealing the faint outline of an object partially buried. It was a small leather satchel, aged and cracked, closed with a simple clasp. Inside were several items: a folded scarf, similar in color to the fabric found at the boathouse, a thin notebook, the pages yellowed, and a pencil, sharpened to a fine point. Mara opened the notebook slowly, flipping through pages filled with neat, careful handwriting. Some were sketches of familiar locations: Evelyn's house, the boathouse, the old mill, but others were less recognizable: narrow alleys, overgrown trails, and patterns of shadows beneath trees. She traced the lines with her finger, noting subtle repetitions, the way certain shapes mirrored each other. It felt as though someone had been mapping the town in quiet observation, a deliberate, patient recording of what most people overlooked. The night settled over Larkspur Bend, soft and thick with mist. Mara stayed by the edge of the woods for a long while, listening to distant water, the occasional bird call, and the whisper of branches against one another. Each subtle sound, each minor shift in shadow, seemed to echo the careful footprints left by Evelyn. or by whoever had moved through the town in silence. She knew, with a quiet certainty, that the path forward was not sudden or dramatic. It was slow, deliberate, measured. Each discovery, each fragment, would lead to the next. And somewhere within these small, quiet movements, the story was waiting to be revealed. The next morning, Mara returned to the outskirts of town, choosing a path she hadn't explored before. The road there was narrower, bordered by tall hedgerows that seemed almost deliberately dense, their branches woven tightly, as if to keep the world at bay. The mist hovered low, curling along the ground and diffusing the early light into a soft, gray haze. Each step pressed the damp earth beneath her boots, leaving impressions that the wind would soon erase. She followed the hedgerow until it opened into a small, neglected park. The benches were worn, the paint flaking in strips. A fountain sat at the center, dry and cracked, the basin filled with leaves and small puddles from recent rain. Mara crouched at the edge of the fountain, brushing aside the debris with gloved hands. There, partially hidden beneath a layer of wet leaves, she found a small, folded piece of paper. The handwriting was delicate, familiar, yet different from the notes she had found before, careful and deliberate. It contained a single word: listen. Mara's gaze drifted around the park. The air was still, except for the subtle rustle of leaves and the distant hum of the town waking. She noticed the way the shadows of the hedges pooled against the cracked paths, the gentle slope of the fountain's edge, the uneven texture of the benches. The words seemed less like a command and more like an invitation, guiding attention toward what was overlooked. A faint noise drew her to the edge of the park, near a line of overgrown shrubs. At first, she thought it was a branch falling, but then she noticed the movement, subtle, rhythmic, almost imperceptible. A small object shifted among the undergrowth, a metal tin, its surface dulled by age. She knelt and lifted it carefully. Inside were several small, polished stones, each etched with tiny symbols, almost too fine to see without close inspection. Some resembled letters, others shapes she could not name. She traced them lightly with her fingers, feeling the smooth, deliberate curves beneath her touch. Later, Mara walked along the narrow streets near the edge of town. The air carried a faint scent of wet stone and iron, and the street lamps cast long, leaning shadows. She noticed a door set back between two buildings, almost entirely hidden, with a small brass knocker shaped like a crescent moon. The door was unlocked. Inside was a narrow hallway, the walls lined with shelves full of jars, each containing dried plants, small bones, and fragments of fabric. Everything was arranged with meticulous care, the air faintly musty but strangely still, as though the space had not been disturbed for some time. On a small table, she found another envelope, similar to the others, unmarked and sealed with plain wax. Inside was a sketch of a familiar scene, the stream near the boathouse, rendered with a precision that suggested repeated observation. Alongside it, a single note: paths cross where the water bends. Mara's thoughts lingered on the words as she stepped back into the street. The phrase seemed simple at first, but her memory traced the bends of the creek, the subtle curves of the stream, the points where shadows pooled and small movements went unnoticed. Each bend she had seen now carried a quiet significance, suggesting a pattern that was not yet complete. By mid-afternoon, she returned to Evelyn's house, walking slowly along the edge of the property. The mailbox leaned slightly, just as it had before. Mara placed her hand on it, feeling the cold metal, and noticed for the first time a faint scratch along the top edge. a single line etched with care. She traced it lightly, sensing the same deliberate intent that ran through every small discovery she had made in the past days. Inside, the house remained still, yet subtly different. The folded photographs she had noted before had shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, and a small stack of envelopes rested on the kitchen counter where they had not been placed before. She opened the top envelope carefully. Inside was a single line. "Follow the sound, not the sight." Mara leaned back, letting the note rest in her hands. She closed her eyes and listened. The faint creak of floorboards, the soft sigh of wind through the pines outside, the distant hum of the town, it all seemed amplified, as if the world had tuned itself to a subtle rhythm she had only just begun to recognize. That evening, she walked along the edge of the woods, letting her senses guide her more than sight. Every fallen branch, every shallow depression in the soil, every whispered sound seemed to carry meaning. She noticed a small hollow beneath a tree, hidden beneath moss and roots. Inside was a bundle, a scarf, damp but clean, a pencil stub, and a fragment of paper with a single symbol etched into it, delicate and deliberate. Mara studied it, letting her gaze drift across the forest. She realized the traces left behind were not random. They were connected, threads weaving through the town, through the woods, along the creeks and abandoned structures. Evelyn's disappearance was not sudden. It was a quiet, intricate sequence, unfolding in deliberate pauses, waiting for someone patient enough to follow. And Mara understood, with a careful certainty, that each small discovery, each quiet observation, was part of a slow, methodical path. She had not yet reached the end, but every step forward felt deliberate, measured, and strangely intimate, as if the town itself were guiding her through the narrative that had quietly been written, waiting just beyond her sight. The morning mist was heavier than usual when Mara returned to the outskirts of Larkspur Bend, settling low into the hollows of the ground, curling around the bases of trees like thin smoke. She moved slowly along the dirt lane that led toward the old quarry, a place long abandoned, where the walls of stone had been cut in neat, sharp lines decades ago and now were softened by moss and creeping vines. The air smelled of damp rock and wet leaves, with the faint tang of iron lingering in the spaces where water had pooled. The quarry was quiet, the only sound a distant drip of water from the cliffside, punctuating the heavy silence. Mara traced the edge of the pit, stepping carefully over loose stones, noting the way sunlight caught on the slick surfaces. Near the old loading platform, half hidden by overgrown brambles, she noticed a thin thread of fabric, gray and soft, caught on a jagged branch. It matched the material she had found in the boathouse and near the stream. She brushed it gently with her fingers, careful not to disturb the branch, and tucked it into her pocket. A few yards farther, at the base of a cliff where the quarry wall curved inward, Mara discovered faint markings in the stone. Not scratches from machinery, but deliberate, almost imperceptible grooves forming lines and shapes. She knelt to examine them, her fingertips tracing the subtle carvings. They resembled letters, or perhaps symbols, but she could not make them out entirely. The grooves were weathered, yet the pattern suggested someone had taken great care in their creation. She followed the path around the curved wall, moving toward a narrow passage where water had eroded the soil into a small tunnel. It was dark inside, the light from the quarry barely reaching beyond the first few steps. Mara shone her flashlight across the walls, revealing streaks of damp earth and the occasional root hanging low. At the end of the tunnel, partially obscured by shadows, was a small cavity in the rock. Inside lay a notebook, its cover worn and soft with age, closed but not sealed. Mara opened it carefully. Inside were sketches, careful and detailed. Some were of familiar locations, the stream, the boathouse, the old mill, but others were less recognizable. Clusters of trees, the folds of the quarry walls, and thin pathways cut through dense undergrowth. Alongside the drawings were notes, written in a meticulous hand, observations of wind patterns, the direction of water flow, the angle of sunlight at different times of day. It was not chaotic, it was deliberate, an intricate record of the landscape as it shifted through hours and days. Mara stood, letting the notebook rest against her chest. The quarry's silence pressed in around her, and she became aware of the faint, rhythmic sound of water dripping somewhere beyond the tunnel. It was steady, subtle, almost like a heartbeat. She followed it, careful not to disturb the loose stones beneath her boots, until she reached a shallow pool where the water collected and ran off through a tiny channel. On the stone beside the pool, a flat, smooth pebble had been placed. It bore a symbol similar to those she had seen on the slate near the creek, a line intersected by a curve, delicate and precise. Later, she walked along the town's abandoned railway again, taking a different route than before. The tracks were cooler in the evening air, dew forming along the rails. Mara paused at a spot where the ground sloped into a shallow embankment. Here, a faint indentation suggested something had rested against the earth for a time, too soft to be a human footprint, too precise for natural settling. She crouched, brushing aside leaves, and discovered a small key, tarnished and simple. It was unlike the other keys she had found. This one felt lighter, more deliberate, as though it had been placed exactly where it could be seen by someone moving slowly, attentively. Returning to Evelyn's house at dusk, Mara noticed the mailbox again. It had shifted slightly more to the left than before, and the light caught a faint etching on its surface, a small crescent shape, almost imperceptible without careful inspection. She traced it with her fingertips and realized that each subtle mark, each carefully placed object, formed a web of guidance. Someone, or Evelyn herself, had been leaving a quiet trail through the overlooked spaces of town, waiting for someone observant enough to follow. Inside, the house smelled faintly of damp wood and the lingering scent of iron, and the air seemed heavier than usual. Mara moved through the room slowly, opening drawers and touching surfaces, noting the subtle shifts. On a shelf in the living room, she found another envelope, plain and unmarked. Inside was a single line. Patterns appear where shadows converge. She lingered near the window, letting her gaze sweep across the yard and into the forest beyond. The light was soft, the shadows stretching across the ground and folding into one another. Every object, every shape, every movement seemed charged with intent. The quiet details of the town, the woods, the streams, the abandoned structures, all of it felt like a deliberate narrative, patient and slow, waiting to be read by someone who would notice. As night fell, Mara left the house, walking slowly along the empty streets. The air was cool, faint mist curling along the sidewalks, carrying the faint scent of wet pine and earth. Every creak of a shutter, every rustle of leaves, every distant water sound seemed significant now, part of a delicate and careful system she was only beginning to trace. She realized that the path ahead would not be immediate, not dramatic. It would unfold quietly, subtly, in a series of small, deliberate discoveries, each one leading to the next, each one shaping her understanding of Evelyn's disappearance, and of the silent, patient world she had left behind. The following morning, Mara took a route she had never explored before, along a narrow gravel lane that curved tightly around the edge of town. The fog hung low, softening the outlines of buildings and fences, settling like a pale veil over the grass and trees. The air was damp, faintly sweet with the scent of fallen leaves and pine needles, carrying with it the distant, hollow sound of water running somewhere beyond the hedgerows. She paused at a small footbridge that arched over a shallow, sluggish stream. The wooden planks were worn and uneven, moss creeping along the edges, and the railings were smooth from years of touch. Mara crouched and ran her hand along the boards, noticing small etchings in the wood, faint initials, geometric lines, almost imperceptible unless observed with care. She traced them slowly, wondering if they were left deliberately, a quiet communication or remnants of something forgotten long ago. Across the bridge, the path narrowed into an overgrown trail that led toward a cluster of abandoned cottages. The windows were darkened with grime. Some panes were broken, others covered with boards. The roofs sagged slightly, weighed by time, and ivy crawled along the walls like veins. Mara moved carefully, stepping over roots and broken stone, and noticed something unusual: a series of small, flat stones laid along the path, each one spaced evenly, forming a subtle line that led toward one of the cottages. The arrangement was deliberate, quiet, and almost invisible unless you slowed to observe. Inside the largest cottage, Mara found the air thick with the scent of old wood and dust. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her weight. A fireplace held remnants of ash and soot, but nothing recently burned. On a narrow shelf above it, a small, leather-bound notebook lay partially hidden behind a row of jars. She pulled it free, brushing the dust off its cover. The pages inside were filled with sketches, faintly numbered diagrams of corners, angles, and shadows. Some pages depicted the cottages themselves. Others showed nearby trees and stretches of path, annotated with small, almost imperceptible notes about direction and light. She moved deeper into the cottage, noticing the quiet signs of habitation: a carefully stacked pile of firewood, a folded blanket tucked behind a chair, a few tools resting neatly on a table. There was no one here, and yet the arrangement of objects suggested attention, deliberate care. Mara paused, listening. The only sound was the distant rustle of leaves against the windows and the soft hum of water from the stream outside. Through a back door, Mara stepped into a small garden, overgrown with weeds and fallen leaves. The smell of damp earth was stronger here, with faint hints of herbs and something more metallic, almost imperceptible. Near the edge of the garden, half hidden under a collapsed trellis, she discovered a shallow depression in the soil. Inside it lay a folded piece of parchment, yellowed at the edges. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. "Look where the light bends." She held it for a long moment, letting the words sink in. The garden was bathed in soft, uneven light, filtered through the broken trellis above. Shadows pooled beneath the overgrown shrubs, stretched across the soil in long, irregular patterns. Each seemed to mark a subtle angle, a quiet guidepost for someone attentive enough to notice. After leaving the cottages, Mara wandered along the edge of the creek once more. Here, the water was clearer, reflecting the sky and the faint mist above. She noticed a small clump of reeds swaying in the current, unusual in its placement. Brushing aside the reeds, she found a tiny, hand-carved figure, smooth and darkened by water. It was roughly shaped like a person, simple yet deliberate in form. She ran her fingers over its surface, noting the attention that had gone into its creation, the care in its placement where it would only be found by someone moving slowly and observing quietly. As twilight fell, Mara returned to the edge of town, walking slowly along the streets she knew so well but now viewed differently. Every fence post, every shutter, every glint of glass in a window seemed charged with meaning. At the base of a street lamp, she found another envelope tucked neatly beneath the post. Inside was a sketch, a map of sorts, depicting her previous discoveries: the stream, the boathouse, the quarry, the cottages, with faint lines connecting each in a pattern she could not yet decipher. A single note accompanied it. The next step waits where earth and water meet. Mara lingered at the street lamp long after the mist had begun to thicken, listening to the faint, rhythmic sound of water from the distant creek, to the whisper of leaves, to the subtle movement of shadows along the walls. She realized the investigation was no longer confined to a single place. Evelyn's trail wove through the overlooked spaces of the town, the quiet edges, the abandoned structures, each clue deliberately placed, each small discovery forming a sequence that required patience, attentiveness, and a willingness to follow the subtle movements of the world around her. And Mara understood that the path ahead would demand the same measured attention. She did not yet know where it would lead, only that each step, each quiet observation, would bring her closer to understanding the deliberate, intricate pattern Evelyn, or whoever had orchestrated these traces, had left behind. The next morning, Mara set out before sunrise, walking along a narrow, seldom-used lane that led to the northern edge of town. The fog lay low over the fields, curling along the tall grasses and pooling in small hollows. Each step pressed damp soil beneath her boots, leaving fleeting impressions that vanished almost immediately under the mist. She noticed the soft scent of wet hay and the faint tang of iron carried on the breeze, mingling with the distant, hollow sound of a creek winding through the trees. She followed the lane until it opened onto a small, overgrown orchard. The trees were old and gnarled, their branches heavy with moss, the fruit long gone. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, damp and muffled underfoot. Mara moved slowly, noticing the small things: a line of stones partially buried near a tree trunk, the way sunlight dappled through broken branches, the gentle brush of wind shifting the moss on the lower limbs. Something caught her eye, a thin strip of ribbon, gray and soft, wrapped lightly around a low branch. She touched it gently and recognized the fabric from previous discoveries. Carefully, she untangled it and folded it into her coat pocket. Deeper in the orchard, she noticed a narrow clearing, almost rectangular, as though the trees themselves had formed it deliberately. At the center, the ground was uneven, with faint depressions forming subtle patterns in the soil. Mara knelt and brushed away leaves, revealing a series of tiny, carved marks in the earth. They were too shallow to be footprints, but deliberate, lines, arcs, and dots forming a sequence she could not yet decipher. She traced them lightly with her gloved finger, feeling the careful intention behind each mark. From there, Mara wandered toward a small pond at the far edge of the orchard. The water was still, reflecting the gray morning sky, broken only by a gentle ripple as a leaf fell from an overhanging branch. At the edge, partially submerged, she noticed a flat stone with faint scratches on its surface. She knelt and examined it more closely. The lines were deliberate, faintly forming letters or symbols, the same careful, meticulous style she had seen on the slate at the creek and the carved pebble in the stream. She traced them slowly, noting a subtle pattern, a connection between the shapes, leading her gaze downstream. Following the water's path, Mara came to a narrow wooden bridge, weathered and leaning slightly to one side. Beneath it, the water ran shallow and clear, revealing a smattering of smooth stones and fallen leaves. At the far end of the bridge, she noticed a small box tucked beneath the railing. It was unmarked and simple, the wood worn but intact. Inside was a bundle of folded fabric, small stones carved with faint symbols, and a single pencil stub. The pencil was sharpened to a fine point, its tip worn from use. Mara ran her finger along it, noting the quiet deliberation in its preparation. By late afternoon, Mara returned to the streets of Larkspur Bend. The town had settled into a quiet rhythm. The occasional car passing, a neighbor sweeping a porch, the faint sound of distant water. She walked slowly, eyes lowered, observing details she had not noticed before. The way shadows pooled beneath fence posts, the irregular texture of sidewalk bricks, the slight lean of a lamppost casting a long line across the street. At the edge of a narrow alley, partially hidden beneath ivy, she found another envelope. Inside was a simple note. Where earth and shadow touch, look closer. She lingered there for some time, letting her gaze drift across the textures of the alley, the rough stone wall, the soft layer of fallen leaves, the faint impressions of something that had rested on the ground. Her attention to small movements, the way light fell across objects, the subtle disturbance of soil or debris, made each detail feel purposeful, as if the town itself were guiding her, marking a path in quiet, deliberate ways. As dusk settled, Mara returned to Evelyn's house, moving slowly along the yard. The mailbox leaned slightly, the top edge catching the fading light, and for the first time she noticed another small etching, a series of tiny, angular lines, precise and deliberate. She traced them lightly with her fingertips, feeling the same careful intent that threaded through every discovery. Inside, the house smelled faintly of damp wood, moss, and iron. Mara moved from room to room, noting subtle changes. A small pile of folded fabric on a chair, a slight shift in the dust along the windowsill, a narrow stack of envelopes on the kitchen counter she hadn't seen before. The latest envelope contained a sketch of a path winding through familiar locations: the orchard, the pond, the bridge, and the quarry. A single note accompanied it. The quietest steps often reveal the most. Mara lingered near the window, watching shadows stretch across the yard, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant water. Every soft sound, every minor movement, every subtle shift seemed deliberate now, part of a larger, patient sequence. She understood that the path ahead would continue slowly, measured by careful observation and the gentle uncovering of subtle signs. Evelyn's trail was still there, waiting, intricate and unhurried, and Mara would follow it, one quiet step at a time. The next morning, Mara rose early, the town still cloaked in a gentle fog. She made her way to a part of Larkspur Bend she had not yet explored, the southern edge, where the road narrowed into a dirt track, flanked by high reeds and wildflowers whose scent was sharp and damp in the cool morning air. The mist softened every shape, turning fences, trees, and abandoned buildings into quiet, muted forms. She stepped slowly, listening to the subtle swish of the reeds against one another, the occasional drip of dew from a low branch, the distant hum of water running along a ditch hidden in the grass. A few hundred yards down the track, Mara came upon a small wooden gate, worn and splintered at the edges, almost invisible beneath ivy. She pushed it gently, the hinge creaking faintly, and found herself in a narrow glade. The ground was uneven, with patches of moss and clumps of fallen leaves. At first glance, it seemed empty, yet as she moved forward, she noticed something unusual: a series of small, flat stones arranged in a curve around the base of a tree. Each stone was smooth, darkened with moisture, and bore a faint, deliberate scratch. The pattern suggested a subtle sequence, a rhythm she could not yet interpret. Mara knelt beside the tree, brushing aside leaves. There, partially buried in the soil, was a small wooden box. Its surface was worn, but the clasp was intact. Inside, she found several folded pieces of fabric, a few pebbles with tiny carvings similar to those she had seen at the orchard and creek, and a small, unmarked envelope. She opened it slowly. Inside was a single sentence, carefully written: "Watch the water mirror the sky." She let her eyes drift over the glade. A shallow pool had formed near the center, reflecting the pale light above. The water's surface was still, save for the occasional ripple from a falling leaf. Mara noticed how the reflections shifted as she moved, how the light bent along the edges of the pool and the stones. She crouched for a long while, studying these subtleties, aware that the message was not about the pool itself, but about observing carefully, noticing the hidden changes in what seemed ordinary. From there, she continued along the dirt track until it led to a small, forgotten bridge spanning a narrow, overgrown canal. The bridge was low and narrow, with rough-hewn rails that had darkened with moisture. As Mara crossed, she noticed faint scratches along the top of the railing, too small to be accidental. She ran her fingers along them, sensing the same careful, deliberate intent present in the orchard stones and the wooden box. Below, the canal water moved slowly, its surface covered in floating leaves, the current barely perceptible. She crouched and peered into the shallow water, spotting a small, dark shape partially hidden beneath a tangle of reeds. It was a fragment of wood, carved with faint, linear marks, worn smooth by water but still deliberate in design. Later, Mara wandered into a narrow side street she had passed countless times but never entered. The buildings here were tightly packed, small shops long closed, their windows dusty and opaque. One shop had a door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was damp, filled with the faint scent of aged paper and wood. The floor was uneven, with scattered debris and cobwebs. Along a shelf, Mara noticed a collection of tiny, folded papers, each tucked into the spaces between old books. She retrieved one and unfolded it. A rough sketch was drawn: the street, the bridge, the glade, connected by thin lines that suggested direction, a subtle path leading onward. By late afternoon, she returned to Evelyn's house. The mailbox leaned slightly farther than before. Mara traced the edge with her fingertips and discovered a tiny notch in the metal, almost imperceptible. Inside the house, the room smelled faintly of damp wood, faint iron, and earth. On the kitchen table lay another envelope, unmarked, inside which was a simple note: "The quietest corners hold the clearest signs." She lingered near the window, observing the yard and the soft fall of light across familiar shapes. Every shadow, every subtle movement of air or leaf seemed imbued with intention. Each discovery, each small, deliberate placement, traced a careful path through the overlooked spaces of the town. Mara realized the investigation was no longer linear. It was a network of quiet clues, delicate traces leading through subtle shifts in the environment. As night approached, she walked slowly through the town, noting the faint glimmer of dew on fences, the shifting shadows along walls, the gentle creak of shutters in the breeze. Somewhere beyond sight, she imagined, the next subtle clue awaited. It would be quiet, deliberate, and require careful observation. Another small thread in the intricate pattern that Evelyn, or whoever had left these traces, had been weaving patiently, waiting for someone attentive enough to follow. Mara understood that she would need to move slowly, notice the small changes, and allow the story to unfold in its own measured time. The next morning, Mara left the streets of town behind and followed a narrow dirt path that led into the woods beyond the northern ridge. The fog clung low to the underbrush, curling around roots and fallen logs. The air smelled of wet moss and decaying leaves, faintly sharp with the tang of iron from the distant creek. Each step pressed her boots into the soft earth, leaving impressions that would be gone with the first gust of wind. After a while, the path opened into a small clearing she had never noticed before. The space was ringed with slender birch trees, their pale trunks catching the diffuse light of the morning. At the center, a circle of stones had been arranged carefully, each one smooth and darkened by damp, with tiny scratches along their edges. Mara knelt, brushing aside moss and leaf litter to reveal more of the etchings. The shapes resembled lines and arcs, similar to those she had seen on the slate and the carved pebble by the creek. There was an underlying rhythm to them, a deliberate sequence she could not yet interpret. Near the edge of the clearing, partially hidden under a tangle of ferns, Mara discovered a small leather pouch. Its surface was soft, worn with age, and inside she found a handful of tiny objects: a fragment of fabric, small stones etched with symbols, and a slender pencil stub. She traced the carvings on the stones with her fingers, noting the precision and care that had gone into them, the same quiet attention she had observed in every other clue. From the clearing, a faint trail led deeper into the woods. Mara followed it slowly, moving around fallen branches and stepping lightly over mossy roots. The forest seemed alive with subtle movements, the soft rustle of leaves, the distant drip of water, the gentle creak of a leaning tree. She noticed how the light shifted as she walked, pooling in small patches on the forest floor, reflecting off damp stones, and catching on the edges of fallen logs. Eventually, she reached a small, abandoned shed. The wood was weathered, gray, and cracked, but the door was ajar, as if inviting her to look inside. The air smelled faintly of earth and metal. Inside, the floor was covered with a thin layer of dust, undisturbed except for a small area near the back wall. Mara knelt and brushed the dust aside, revealing a narrow rectangle of slightly darker wood. It was a hidden compartment. She lifted the panel and found a single envelope, sealed simply with wax. Inside was a note, written in careful, deliberate handwriting. "Follow the echoes, not the sight." Mara held it in her hands and let her eyes drift around the shed. The faint hum of wind through the cracks in the wood, the soft drip of water from the roof, the subtle rustle of leaves outside, all became amplified, almost as if the environment itself were speaking, waiting for her to notice. She traced her finger over the floor, over the walls, over the gaps between the boards, realizing that each sound, each shadow, each subtle change might be a marker, a quiet sign pointing the way. She left the shed and continued along a narrow ridge, the ground sloping gently toward a small creek she had only glimpsed before. The water was shallow and clear, rippling faintly over smooth stones. At the edge of the bank, partially submerged, was a small wooden token, carved with a delicate symbol. Mara retrieved it and held it in her hand, feeling the worn smoothness of the surface, the careful design, and the quiet intent behind its placement. By late afternoon, Mara returned to the town, moving slowly through streets she now saw differently. Every fence, every lamppost, every shutter seemed to carry subtle shifts in shadow, hints of movement, and the faintest traces of intention. At the base of an old brick wall, she found another envelope, tucked carefully beneath a loose brick. Inside was a small sketch, a map of her previous discoveries, the clearing, the shed, the creek, connected by faint, subtle lines that suggested direction, a path she had not yet taken. When she arrived back at Evelyn's house, the mailbox had shifted slightly again, just enough that it caught the fading light. Mara traced the edge of the metal, noticing a faint, deliberate groove along the surface. Inside the house, the room smelled of damp wood and iron, familiar and still. On the kitchen table, a small stack of envelopes had appeared that she had not noticed before. The top one contained a single line. Attention uncovers what is hidden. Mara lingered at the window, letting her gaze drift over the yard and into the distant forest. Every soft sound, every subtle movement, every quiet shadow now seemed like part of a deliberate sequence. The trail, she realized, was not sudden or dramatic. It unfolded in patience and care, one quiet observation leading to the next. And somewhere, just beyond her sight, the next subtle clue awaited, ready for someone careful enough to notice. The next morning, Mara set out toward the eastern outskirts of Larkspur Bend, where the forest thinned into low hills and scattered meadows. The fog lay thick over the landscape, softening the outlines of the trees and muting the colors of the wildflowers and grass. The air carried the scent of damp earth and the faint metallic tang of iron, lingering from recent rain. Each step pressed her boots into the soft soil, and she moved slowly, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant drip of water from hidden streams. Along a winding path that led through the hills, Mara noticed a small stone wall, half collapsed, overgrown with ivy. At first, it seemed unremarkable, but on closer inspection, she discovered tiny notches carved along the edges of the stones. They were subtle, deliberate, following no natural pattern. She ran her fingers over them, feeling the careful attention that had gone into each mark, then stepped along the wall, noticing how the spacing of the notches seemed to guide her gaze toward the top of a nearby rise. At the crest of the hill, the path opened onto a tiny glen she had never seen before. A thin, trickling stream ran through it, its surface broken by small clusters of reeds and fallen branches. On one bank, a small wooden stake had been driven into the earth. Tied to it was a fragment of cloth, soft and gray, familiar in its texture from the other discoveries. Mara untied it carefully and tucked it into her pocket, observing how the wind made the edges flutter slightly, as if marking her attention to the spot. A short distance downstream, the glen narrowed, the path hemmed in by rocks and low shrubs. Mara stepped carefully over roots and stones, noticing the faint depressions in the damp earth, impressions that suggested something had rested here recently. Partially hidden beneath the roots of a fallen tree, she found a small, metal box, darkened with age and moisture. Inside were several smooth pebbles etched with fine symbols, a pencil stub, and a folded piece of paper. The handwriting was careful, deliberate. Follow the bends where water and shadow meet. Mara let her gaze drift along the stream. The water's surface reflected the pale morning light, shifting gently as the current moved over stones. Shadows pooled beneath overhanging branches, folding softly into one another. She crouched, observing the small changes in light and water, aware that each subtle detail carried meaning. The marks, the objects, the folded notes, they were not random. They formed a quiet pattern, a deliberate trail through spaces most people overlooked. From the glen, she moved toward a cluster of abandoned farm buildings at the edge of the hills. The wooden structures leaned slightly with age, roofs sagging, paint flaking. She stepped through the gate carefully, listening to the soft creak of hinges and the faint whistle of wind through broken windows. Inside a small barn, the air was heavy with the scent of aged wood and hay. A narrow shaft of light from a missing plank illuminated the floor, and Mara noticed a small rectangle of disturbed straw. Kneeling, she brushed it aside and uncovered another envelope, unmarked. Inside was a simple line: "Look beneath what the eye ignores." She moved slowly through the barn, paying attention to every subtle texture and shadow. Beneath loose boards in the corner, she found a shallow cavity containing a few small, worn objects: a carved pebble, a tiny notebook, and a fragment of gray fabric. Each had been placed carefully, quietly, meant to be discovered only by someone moving attentively, observing the minutiae of the environment. By late afternoon, Mara returned to the familiar streets of town, her mind tracing the connections between each subtle discovery. The mailbox at Evelyn's house had shifted slightly again, and on the edge of the metal, she noticed a faint groove, tiny and deliberate. Inside the house, the air smelled of damp wood and earth. A new envelope had appeared on the counter. Inside was another sketch, a faint map showing the glen, the stream, the barn, and the hills, connected by thin, winding lines. A single note accompanied it: "Patience uncovers the hidden sequence." Mara lingered at the window, observing the fading light across the yard, the shifting shadows in the forest beyond. Every soft sound, every subtle movement, every faint reflection of light seemed charged with purpose. She understood now that Evelyn's trail was not abrupt or loud. It was patient, deliberate, hidden in quiet corners, in subtle angles, in the small, unremarked movements of the world. And somewhere beyond sight, the next quiet clue awaiting the careful attention that would reveal it. The next morning, Mara chose a route along the western edge of town, where the hills sloped into a narrow valley dotted with low stone walls and scattered groves of oak. The fog hung heavy over the fields, softening every edge and muting colors into shades of gray and green. Each step pressed damp earth beneath her boots, and the faint scent of wet moss and decaying leaves filled the air, mingled with a faint metallic tang that seemed to linger from the creek farther upstream. She followed a narrow track that wound between the groves, the grass wet and bending underfoot. Along the way, she noticed subtle disturbances in the soil, shallow impressions that were too deliberate to be accidental, as if something small had been placed, then removed. She crouched to examine one and found a tiny wooden token partially buried in the dirt, etched with delicate lines, worn smooth by time and weather. She traced the carvings slowly, feeling the careful attention in each mark. A few hundred yards farther, the path opened onto a small abandoned orchard. The trees were older here, gnarled and thin, with patches of moss on their trunks. Fallen leaves carpeted the ground, muffling her steps. Near the center, she found a shallow depression in the soil, lined with smooth stones arranged in a circle. At the edge of the circle, a strip of gray fabric peeked out from under leaves, faintly damp. She retrieved it carefully, noting the same texture as the other fragments she had collected over the past days. Beyond the orchard, a narrow trail led to a low, stone-lined stream. Mara knelt at its edge, observing how the water moved over small stones, reflecting the diffuse morning light. Among the reeds, half submerged, was a small, rectangular wooden box. She lifted it gently, brushing away the mud and leaves. Inside were a few pebbles etched with tiny symbols, a small notebook, and a pencil stub. The notebook contained sketches of locations she had already visited: the glen, the creek, the abandoned barn, each marked with faint lines connecting points in a pattern she did not yet understand. Following the stream, Mara came to a footbridge she had never crossed before. The wood was weathered, the railings leaning slightly with age. Beneath the bridge, the water moved slowly, pooling in shallow depressions before continuing onward. At the far end, partially hidden by fallen branches, she discovered a small envelope, unmarked. Inside was a single phrase, written carefully: "Observe the quiet intersections." Mara lingered, letting her eyes follow the subtle changes in light and shadow across the water, the way the branches bent and swayed, the gentle ripple of the current over stones. She realized that each small discovery, each carefully placed object, each faint mark, formed a network, a deliberate sequence that could only be understood through careful observation and patience. By late afternoon, she returned to the older streets of Larkspur Bend. The town had settled into a quiet rhythm, faint lights flickering in windows, the occasional sound of distant water, the soft creak of shutters in the breeze. At the edge of a narrow alley, partially hidden behind a leaning fence, Mara found another envelope. Inside was a sketch showing the creek, the orchard, the bridge, and a series of subtle markers along the path between them. A note accompanied it: "Patience sees what is hidden in plain sight." Mara lingered at the alley entrance, letting her gaze sweep over every small detail: the uneven texture of brick walls, the subtle pooling of shadows, the faint movement of leaves along the fence line. Each tiny element seemed intentional, part of a quiet, deliberate pattern, waiting to be observed. She understood, with a slow certainty, that the trail would continue to unfold in this measured, patient way. The next clue, like all the others, would appear quietly, subtly, for those willing to watch, listen, and follow without rush. As night settled over Larkspur Bend, Mara walked slowly back toward Evelyn's house. The mailbox had shifted slightly again, catching the soft glow of the street lamp. She traced the faint groove along its edge with her fingertips, noting the care in its placement. Inside, the house smelled faintly of damp wood and earth. A new envelope rested on the kitchen counter. She opened it, finding a single line: "Where edges meet, look closely." Mara stood by the window for a long time, letting her eyes drift across the yard, the street, the faint shadows in the surrounding woods. Every movement, every subtle shift of light and shadow, every quiet sound seemed meaningful now, forming an intricate web of patient, deliberate traces. She understood that each discovery was part of a careful sequence, one she had only begun to follow, and that the next step would reveal itself not through force or urgency, but through quiet attention, observation, and care. The following morning, Mara took a narrow lane that curved along the outskirts of the southern marshlands, a part of Larkspur Bend she had seldom visited. The mist lingered low over the shallow pools of water, blurring the edges of reeds and cattails. Each step pressed soft, spongy earth beneath her boots, sending faint ripples through the scattered puddles. The air was cool and damp, carrying the faint scent of mud and decaying vegetation. And somewhere in the distance, a heron let out a low, drawn-out call. Along the edge of the marsh, she noticed a slight rise in the ground, a mound of earth that seemed almost deliberate amid the uneven terrain. She approached slowly, brushing aside the damp reeds and fallen branches. At its crest lay a small, flat stone, half buried and etched with a faint symbol, an arc intersected by a line, delicate and careful, matching the markings she had seen at the creek, the glen, and the orchard. Mara ran her fingers over it, feeling the subtle grooves beneath her touch, the deliberate intention behind its placement. Following a faint path that twisted through the reeds, Mara came upon a low wooden platform, partially submerged in water. Its boards were slick with moss and moisture, the edges softened by years of exposure. At one corner, a small bundle had been left, a folded piece of gray fabric, damp but clean, and a thin pencil stub. Next to it, a tiny wooden token rested atop a stone, etched with faint symbols she could not yet interpret fully. She traced the lines carefully, realizing that each small object she discovered seemed to point not to itself, but to the next quiet, overlooked location. A short walk along the marsh led her to an old drainage channel, lined with stones and partially overgrown with moss and weeds. The water moved slowly through it, carrying leaves and small twigs. Near a bend, Mara noticed a faint indentation in the muddy bank, almost as if something small had been placed and removed recently. Digging carefully with her fingers, she uncovered a small envelope, unmarked, with a single, deliberate note inside. Where reflection gathers, the next trace waits. Mara crouched by the water's edge, noticing the surface of the shallow pool reflecting the pale light of the morning sky. Subtle ripples caused by the wind bent the shapes of reeds and trees, forming patterns that seemed to shift as she watched. Her gaze lingered on these shifting reflections, aware that Evelyn, or whoever had left these traces, had chosen this spot for its quiet, hidden significance. Continuing along the path, Mara came to a line of abandoned storage sheds, low and weathered, their paint faded and peeling. One shed had a partially open door. Inside, the air smelled faintly of damp wood and rust. The floorboards creaked softly beneath her steps. Along a shelf, partially hidden under dust and cobwebs, was a small notebook. She opened it carefully. The pages contained sketches of the marsh, the platform, the drainage channel, and other locations she had visited, connected by fine lines that suggested pathways or sequences. There were faint notations about light, wind, and water flow, precise observations of the environment that she had only just begun to notice herself. By late afternoon, Mara returned to the streets near Evelyn's house. The town had grown quiet, the soft hum of distant water and the occasional creak of shutters filling the air. At the edge of a narrow alley, she found another envelope tucked beneath a loose brick. Inside was a small sketch of the marsh, the drainage channel, and the storage sheds, connected by delicate lines, with one simple phrase written carefully. Listen to what is not immediately visible. She lingered at the alley entrance, observing subtle movements, shadows shifting with the waning light, the gentle sway of tree branches, the faint disturbance of leaves in the breeze. Every small sound, every nuanced detail seemed purposeful now, a continuation of the deliberate, patient trail that Evelyn, or the person leaving these clues, had been weaving throughout the town. As night approached, Mara walked slowly back toward the familiar edges of the town. The mailbox at Evelyn's house caught the soft glow of a lamp, and she noticed another faint groove along its surface, tiny and precise. Inside, a new envelope rested on the counter. She opened it carefully. Inside was a single line. The hidden path reveals itself to patience alone. Mara stood by the window, letting her gaze drift over the yard, the forest, the distant marsh, and the soft shadows that had begun to deepen with the falling night. Every subtle shift, every quiet movement, every faint reflection of light was a marker, a deliberate part of a network she was only beginning to trace. She understood that the next clue would appear not through haste or force, but through careful attention, quiet observation, and a slow, deliberate following of the pattern that continued to unfold, patiently waiting for someone willing to notice. The next morning, Mara chose a route along the eastern edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and the land sloped toward a series of small hills. The fog lingered low over the ground, curling around moss-covered rocks and tangled undergrowth. The air smelled of damp pine and wet earth, and she could hear the soft, distant trickle of water from a hidden stream winding through the hills. Each step pressed the damp soil beneath her boots, leaving temporary impressions that would vanish as the fog shifted. As she moved slowly along a faint trail, Mara noticed a narrow clearing between two clusters of oak trees. The grass here was flattened in a subtle pattern, like a rough path that had been trodden frequently but without haste. She knelt to examine the ground and found a small, flat stone embedded in the earth, etched with faint, deliberate symbols, lines and arcs she had seen before, faintly matching the markings on the stones by the creek and the glen. She traced them carefully, feeling the intentionality in each groove. Following the flattened path, she arrived at a low ridge overlooking a shallow valley. The fog swirled around the bases of the trees and the edges of the small pools of water that dotted the landscape. There, half buried in the moss near the edge of a large rock, Mara discovered a small, leather-bound notebook. Its cover was worn and damp, but intact. Inside, the pages contained detailed sketches of the valley, the scattered pools, and nearby hills, connected by faint lines she did not yet understand. Notes in careful handwriting recorded subtle observations: the angle of sunlight across the rocks at different times of day, the direction of the wind through the reeds, the gentle movement of water over stones. She continued along the ridge and came to a fallen tree that had partially blocked the path. Beneath its gnarled roots, she noticed a shallow indentation in the soil filled with damp leaves. Moving them aside, she uncovered a small bundle wrapped in gray fabric. Inside were several tiny pebbles, etched with familiar symbols, a pencil stub, and a folded scrap of paper. The note inside read simply, "Follow the gentle bends where shadow and water meet." Mara looked down into the valley below. A narrow stream curved lazily through the moss and reeds, reflecting the pale morning light. The shadows of the trees pooled along the banks, shifting gently with the breeze. She crouched beside the stream, observing the subtle interplay of light, shadow, and movement. Each ripple, each reflection, seemed significant, part of a careful pattern she was only beginning to trace. Further along the stream, she noticed a small wooden platform, barely above the water, weathered and soft with moss. At its corner rested a flat stone, carved with faint, delicate markings. Next to it, a fragment of gray fabric peeked out from under a clump of reeds. Mara picked it up carefully, noting the familiar texture and the deliberate placement, as if meant for someone attentive enough to notice. By late afternoon, she returned to town, moving slowly through familiar streets now transformed by quiet attention to detail. At the edge of a narrow alley near Evelyn's house, she found another envelope tucked beneath a loose brick. The following morning, Mara returned to the valley beyond the eastern ridge, moving deliberately along the familiar path. The mist was lighter now, drifting in soft curls across the low hills and shallow pools. She had begun to notice patterns she hadn't seen before: the placement of stones, the subtle curves of trails, the faint alignments of shadows and light. Each small observation, once isolated, now began to form a quiet coherence. As she followed the stream, she realized that the objects she had collected, the carved pebbles, the fragments of fabric, the small wooden tokens, were not random or symbolic in a cryptic sense. They were markers, deliberate signposts pointing toward careful observation of the environment itself. Evelyn, she realized, had left a trail not as a riddle to be solved, but as a sequence of attentive interactions, to notice, to pause, to see what most would overlook. Near the wooden platform in the stream, Mara knelt and let the water ripple across her fingers. She traced the lines of light reflected on the surface and compared them with the sketches in the leather-bound notebook. Slowly, a pattern emerged: the bends of the stream, the placement of stones, the shallow depressions in the soil, the small mounds and platforms. They formed a subtle path through the landscape, a network connecting the overlooked spaces where Evelyn had spent her time. Each mark, each fragment, corresponded to a place she had touched, arranged so that someone patient enough could follow and understand. Mara walked through the orchard one last time. The circle of stones in the center, the flattened paths between the trees, the depressions in the soil, they were all part of the same sequence. The purpose had never been dramatic. Evelyn had wanted to leave traces of presence, quiet markers of where she had been, and perhaps of what she had observed: the changing light, the movement of water, the whisper of leaves. Mara understood, as she gently rearranged one of the fallen leaves, that the sequence was a meditation, a map of attentive living. Returning to the shed near the hills, Mara paused at the small cavity beneath the floorboards. The bundle of pebbles and notes rested quietly in place. She examined them in context now, seeing how each detail fit into the larger picture. The gentle repetition, the small calibrations of distance, shadow, and sound. Evelyn had moved through the world deliberately, leaving evidence not of a crime or a secret, but of a presence and a careful attention to the quiet rhythms of her surroundings. By evening, Mara returned to Evelyn's house. The mailbox and the familiar groove, the envelopes, the sketches, they no longer felt mysterious in a threatening way. They were extensions of the same deliberate attention she had followed in the landscape. Mara set the objects she had collected neatly on the table: the pebbles, the fragments of fabric, the notebooks. Looking at them, she could trace Evelyn's movements as though reading a diary written in the language of small, quiet actions. Sitting by the window, Mara watched the last pale light fade from the valley and hills. Shadows lengthened across the yards and streets, settling softly into the familiar contours of town. She understood that Evelyn had vanished not in a moment of sudden drama, but gradually, quietly, leaving behind a trail that spoke of patience, observation, and a mindful presence. The mystery was not about danger or violence. It was about understanding, noticing, and following the quiet sequence of deliberate traces. Mara rose and placed the final envelope atop the counter. She stepped outside, breathing in the cool evening air, and walked slowly along the familiar streets. The patterns, the markers, the subtle signs, all had been revealed in their own time. She felt a sense of closure, not of revelation or confrontation, but of gentle comprehension. Evelyn's presence lingered in the quiet corners, the bends of the stream, the arches of trees, the soft interplay of light and shadow. Mara understood that the trail had never been about finding a dramatic truth, but about learning to see, to notice, and to move through the world with deliberate care. As the night settled, the town hushed into stillness. Mara paused one last time by the window, looking out over the valley and the hills, listening to the soft movement of leaves, the distant hum of water, the gentle rhythm of wind through the trees. The case had resolved itself in observation, reflection, and quiet understanding. The subtle traces of presence remained, but the search was complete. And in that stillness, Mara felt the soft, calm satisfaction of a mystery unfolded naturally, its quiet pattern now fully visible to the careful eye.